Two military police cruisers screamed to a stop in front of Harlow Veterans Medical Center in Creston Falls, Washington. The doors burst open before the engines even died. Four armed MPs moved in tight formation through the automatic doors, boots striking the polished floor with the kind of rhythm that made everyone in the lobby look up at the same instant. The way people look up during a thunderclap, reflexively, before they've even processed the sound. They walked straight to a nurse standing beside a trauma cart near the reception desk. She had a patient chart in one hand and a blood pressure cuff in the other. "Nora Vance!" The lead officer's voice cut clean through the wing, through the ambient beeping of monitors and the low murmur of a Tuesday morning hospital. "You're under arrest." A nearby orderly stumbled backward into the cart. Not Nora. She didn't flinch, didn't step back, didn't look around for help or an exit or anyone to make this make sense. She stood completely still while the room detonated around her. Phones appearing from pockets, heads swiveling from every corridor, a circling tide of shock and appetite pulling everyone closer, the way a crowd always moves towards something it doesn't yet understand. And in the center of it all, Nora Vance looked at the MP who had spoken her name and said, quietly, almost gently, "May I see the documentation?" Nobody expected that. Nobody expected calm. If this story already has you leaning forward, stay with me until the very end. Subscribe so you don't miss what's coming. Drop a like and leave a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now let's go back to where it all began. Tishkina. Creston Falls sat in the flatter eastern stretch of Washington state, far enough from Seattle that it operated according to its own rhythms. Slower, more insular, with the particular character of a mid-sized city that had grown up around its institutions rather than in spite of them. The VA hospital on Creston's north side, the county courthouse 2 miles south, the University Extension campus out by the river. People here tended to know one another across those institutions in the way people do in cities of that size, where professional communities overlap at the edges and everyone eventually becomes a mutual acquaintance of someone else. Harlow Veterans Medical Center was the largest employer in the county. It had expanded 3 times in 20 years, sprawling across what had once been a residential block into a connected campus of older brick buildings and newer glass additions that never quite matched aesthetically but functioned well enough together. Its emergency department ran at over 90% capacity most days. On Tuesdays, it was typically worse, for reasons nobody had ever successfully explained. Some artifact of weekend patterns, perhaps, of people waiting through Saturday and Sunday to see whether a problem resolved itself, and arriving Monday night having decided it wouldn't. Nora Vance had worked the day shift in that ED for 14 months. She had transferred from a private trauma center in Spokane under circumstances that were entirely unremarkable on paper. No disciplinary flags, no personnel issues, solid references from 2 attending physicians, and a charge nurse who had described her in writing as one of the most reliably competent emergency nurses I have worked with in 20 years. She had shown up for her first shift at Harlow, passed her orientation assessments, and folded herself into the department's rhythms the way experienced nurses do. Without announcement, without drama, by simply doing the work at a level that made people around her quietly glad she was there. She was 34 years old, close-cropped dark hair, kept short for practical reasons. A face that was more interesting than conventionally pretty, angular, watchful, with the particular quality of attention that made her seem like she was always processing slightly more information than she appeared to be. She moved through the department with an economy that was almost architectural, no wasted motion, everything calibrated to purpose. She remembered patient names and family details without recording them. She caught IV complications before monitors alarmed. She could de-escalate a combative patient in under 2 minutes, using a tone of voice so steady it seemed almost geological. Other nurses had learned, across 14 months and without much discussion, that Nora Vance was the person you wanted beside you when something went wrong. Not because she said reassuring things, she didn't particularly, but because she simply did not come apart. And in emergency medicine, that quality was rarer and more valuable than almost anything else. The dog tags were something people noticed once and then stopped noticing. They hung around her neck on a worn military bead chain, partially tucked inside her scrubs, occasionally catching the overhead fluorescence when she leaned across a patient bed or reached over a cart. They were plain, no decorative chain, nothing added to them. They looked exactly like what they were. Actual service identification, worn smooth at the edges from years of wear rather than months. Early in her time at Harlow, a colleague named Brianna Solis had asked about them during a slow afternoon in the break room, the kind of small talk that fills silence between crises. Nora had said simply and without elaboration, "I served," and then redirected the conversation to a patient in Bay 6 whose IV had gone positional. Brianna had let it go. Most people let it go. There was something in the way Nora closed subjects, not rudely, not coldly, just firmly, that communicated a boundary clearly enough that most people respected it without fully understanding why they were doing so. Dr. Marcus Hale was not most people. He had been attending at Harlow for 11 years, long enough that the institution had partially organized itself around his preferences in the small, invisible ways that institutions accommodate their most prominent members. He was a vascular surgeon of genuine skill. His outcomes held up to scrutiny. His complication rates were consistently below benchmark, and he had received 2 state medical board commendations in the last decade. The hospital website featured him prominently. He had a particular posture in photographs, arms crossed, chin slightly lifted, the composed confidence of a man who had been right more often than he'd been wrong, and had been told so frequently enough that he'd stopped being able to distinguish confidence from certainty. In the hallways and nursing stations of the ED, Hale operated with the particular entitlement of someone who had been consistently accommodated. Not a cruel man precisely, not someone who set out to diminish people, but someone for whom the world had long arranged itself conveniently, and who had therefore lost the habit of considering how it arranged itself for others. He had never had much use for Nora Vance. She gave him accurate clinical information, followed protocol without error, executed her responsibilities at a level he could not professionally fault. But she didn't add the softening layer that some of the newer staff had learned to apply around him. The extra beat of deference, the slight adjustment in posture, the way certain people made themselves a little smaller when a specific kind of authority walked into a room. Nora didn't do any of that. She was professional, she was direct, and she was completely indifferent to whether he found her agreeable. It wasn't hostility. It was simply her default setting. But men like Hale had a way of reading the absence of visible deference as a statement being made against them, and they filed things like that, quietly, and waited. He had been filing things about Nora Vance for a while. The confrontation happened at the nursing station outside Trauma Bay 2 at 10:43 on a Tuesday morning. Hale was coming off a difficult start, a post-operative complication in a patient he'd seen at 6 a.m. Nothing catastrophic, but the kind of development that required an extended conversation with the patient's family in a small room, and those conversations left a residue that didn't shake off easily. He was moving through the corridor faster than the space really warranted, already thinking about the next case, when he rounded the corner and very nearly walked directly into Nora, who was standing at the station updating a medication chart. She'd taken one step back to avoid contact. In the available half-second, it was the best either of them could do. "Watch it," he said. "Sorry," she said, without looking up from the chart. That was the problem. Or rather, that was enough. The apology was present but tonally flat, absent the particular quality he had unconsciously come to expect. He stopped, actually stopped, instead of continuing past, and looked at her. The chain at her neck had shifted when she stepped back, and the dog tags were visible now. 2 small, dull rectangles of metal lying against her sternum. "Those real?" he said. She glanced up from the chart. "Excuse me?" "The tags." He gestured toward her collar, a small, deliberate motion. "Military dog tags. Are they actual, or is that a fashion thing?" The nursing station had 4 people in it. Brianna Solis stood 3 feet to Nora's left, updating a whiteboard. Unit clerk Devin Marsh sat at the desk behind the station, supposedly entering data. A third-year medical student named Priya Anand had been reviewing a chart at the end of the counter and had, at some point in the last 30 seconds, stopped reviewing it. Nora looked at Hale for a moment, a specific, measured kind of look, the look of someone deciding whether a question is worth answering in the way it deserves. Then, "They're real." The sound was small and deliberate, the vocal equivalent of a raised eyebrow. "What branch?" "Army." "What unit?" A pause. Not hesitation. Something more purposeful. The pause of someone choosing their words rather than reaching for them. I'm not able to discuss specifics of my service. Hale's expression shifted into something that performed concern while being, underneath, considerably colder. Not able to, or not willing to. Dr. Hale, that was Brianna trying to intercept. I'm asking a simple question, he said, not turning to her. His voice had lifted just enough. Not shouting, nothing so blunt, just elevated past the range that keeps conversations private. The ambient noise of the station felt suddenly quieter around it. I ask because I served. 8 years, surgical corps, Walter Reed, and 2 overseas postings. And I know what a legitimate service record sounds like. I know how veterans talk about their service, what they know, what they remember. He paused, letting that land. And I know what it sounds like when someone can't answer basic questions about their unit. Nora's jaw was set. Her hands on the chart were still. I'm not required to detail classified service information in a hospital corridor. Classified. He repeated the word in a tone that made it sound like something someone might say when they were making up an excuse. That's convenient. Marcus, Brianna's voice had sharpened. That's enough. Is it? He turned to look at her briefly, then back to Nora. We have real veterans in this building, patients who sacrificed years, who carry injuries they'll have the rest of their lives. And I think those people deserve to know whether the staff around them actually shares that experience, or whether someone is, he chose the next word with visible care, borrowing it. He turned and walked away. Nora stood very still for a moment. She picked up her chart, clicked her pen, said, in a voice that had not changed register by a single degree, Bay 4's fluid balance needs to be checked. And she walked toward Bay 4 without another word or a single backward glance. Behind her, Devin had stopped typing. Priya had set down the chart she'd been holding. Brianna stood with her arms partly crossed, watching Nora's back disappear around the corner, and felt the specific unease of someone who has just witnessed something catch fire and doesn't yet know how far it will spread. Devin Marsh posted the clip at 12:17 p.m. He would explain later at considerable length that he had only meant to share it with one person, a friend in the ICU who knew Hale and would have appreciated, as Devin had, the particular satisfaction of watching someone fail to intimidate a person who simply wasn't intimidatable. He hadn't thought about framing. He hadn't added context or caption beyond a single line that read, "This just happened in the ED, make of it what you will." He'd posted it to a regional nursing forum with maybe 400 members, hit send, and gone to eat lunch. By 1 p.m., it had been shared 22 times. The mutation happened fast, the way it always does when a clip is just ambiguous enough to absorb whatever the viewer brings to it. By the second wave of reposts, the caption had been replaced by something that hadn't come from Devin. Something that read, "Nurse at Veterans Hospital confronted about military dog tags, refuses to answer any questions, claims it's classified." Then someone replied that they had looked her up and found no public record of her service. Then someone else added that wearing dog tags without having served was a known trend. A third commenter is a stranger, no connection to Harlow or Creston Falls or any person involved, used the phrase stolen valor. And from that moment forward, the phrase became the organizing principle around which every subsequent comment arranged itself. It always does. The hashtag reached 400 uses by 3 p.m. 2 local news accounts had screenshot posted it by 3:45. By 4 p.m., a veterans advocacy group in Seattle had shared a link with the comment, "This is exactly what we fight against." By 4:30, the post had been seen by enough people that several of Harlow's own staff were reading about their colleague on their phones in the break room and arriving at opinions before any of them had thought to ask Nora directly what had actually happened. Marcus Hale read through the threads at 4:15 p.m. at his desk, eating a sandwich, his afternoon cases completed. He scrolled for several minutes. He did not post a correction. He did not contact administration to provide context. He did not reach out to Nora. What he did at 4:48 p.m. was called Gerald Stowe. Stowe worked in the VA regional office and had known Hale through professional channels for 7 years. A straight-backed, morally serious man who had genuine and deeply held convictions about stolen valor and the integrity of military service. Hale framed the call carefully. He wasn't making an accusation, he told Stowe. He was raising a concern, as a fellow veteran, about something he'd witnessed. A nurse at Harlow had been displaying military identification and representing herself as having served, but when directly asked about the specifics of her service, she had been entirely unable, or unwilling, to provide any substantive answers. Given the hospital's veteran patient population and the institution's obligations to that community, Hale felt someone with the appropriate authority ought to look into it. Stowe said he understood. He would make some calls. Hale thanked him, finished his sandwich, and moved on to his end-of-day paperwork. Brianna found Nora in the supply room at 4:45 with her phone in one hand and a look on her face that communicated clearly that she was about to deliver news she wished someone else had been assigned to deliver. "There are posts," Brianna said. "I know." Nora was restocking the middle shelf. Gauze packs, ordered by size, placed with the same precision she brought to everything. Her hands didn't stop. "It's everywhere. They're calling it stolen valor. Thousands of shares, Nora. Thousands." Brianna held out her phone. The screen showed a comment count that had passed 10,000 on the largest post. People are furious, and they don't know you. They don't have any context. They just saw the clip, and I know what they saw. "Then do something." Brianna's voice cracked slightly at the edges. "Post something. Go to HR. Call a lawyer. Call someone. Tell people the truth." Nora set the last gauze pack on the shelf, straightened, and turned around. She looked at Brianna with something that was patient and tired in equal measure. The specific fatigue of someone who has thought through every option in the time it took other people to realize there were options to consider. "The truth requires context I'm not legally allowed to provide. If I post something vague, it looks like I'm deflecting. If I say anything specific, I violate federal law. And if I stay quiet, I look guilty." She picked up her clipboard from the supply cart. "None of those are good choices. I'm picking the one that doesn't get me arrested for something I actually did do." Brianna stared at her. "That's the most rational and most horrifying thing I've ever heard someone say. Bay 7 still febrile?" "Yes, but Nora, I'll check on her." But Patricia Odom called her in at 5:30. The hospital director's office was on the third floor, corner room, with a view of the parking structure, and beyond it, the flat eastern horizon turning amber in the late afternoon. Odom was behind her desk when Nora entered. 3 monitors running, all of them showing some version of the same story, the same clip cropped and recaptioned and distributed across different platforms in slightly different forms, like a single stone dropping into water, and the ripples arriving on different shores. Odom was a careful, fundamentally decent administrator who had run Harlow through 2 funding crises and 1 serious malpractice situation without losing either her composure or, as far as Nora could tell, her integrity. She was also an administrator, which meant that the institution's interests and any individual's interests, when they diverged, followed a predictable order. "Close the door," she said. Nora closed it, sat in the chair across from the desk. Odom did not ease into it. "I've had 4 calls in the last 2 hours. The VA regional liaison, 2 board members, and the director of our veteran outreach partnership. This situation has gotten significant traction, and it is not moving in a direction that's sustainable for this hospital." She folded her hands. "I need to ask you directly, Nora. Is there any truth to the claim that your military service record is not genuine?" "No," Nora said. "There isn't. Can you provide documentation?" "I can provide what's releasable under federal law. Parts of my service record are sealed by federal order. Those I cannot provide, and I can't explain the reason they're sealed without violating the same order." Odom looked at her for a long moment, not unkindly, but with the particular expression of someone doing math that isn't adding up the way they'd like. "That's not going to be enough to address what's happening publicly." "I know. Then you understand why I have to place you on administrative leave pending a formal investigation." She said it carefully, and with what appeared to be genuine regret. "This isn't a judgment of your character. It's a procedural response to an institutional situation." "I understand." Odom started to say something else, something softer, perhaps, something personal. Nora stood before she got there and placed her badge and her access card on the edge of the desk with a quiet, final sound. "Mrs. Okafor in Bay 9 needs her pain management protocol reviewed at handoff," Nora said. "The chart notation for my last assessment is flagged incomplete. The night team should know before they take over." Odom blinked. I'll make sure they're told. Nora nodded once and left. She changed out of her scrubs in the empty locker room, the overhead light humming faintly against the metal doors. She folded everything with mechanical precision. She sat for 2 minutes on the bench with her bag in her lap and her hands resting flat on top of it, and whatever was happening in those 2 minutes stayed entirely behind her eyes, entirely unshared, entirely her own. Then she stood up, put on her jacket, and went to her car. She sat in the parking lot for another minute, not on her phone, not crying, just sitting in the particular stillness of someone processing something too large to feel all at once. And then she started the engine and drove home through a Creston Falls evening that looked identical to any other Creston Falls evening, unremarkable and ordinary, the kind of evening that has no idea what it's sitting inside of. The arrest order moved faster than anyone at Harlow anticipated. Gerald Stowe was a man of genuine conviction who had spent 15 years fighting misappropriation of military identity and took every report seriously. The call from Hale had provided enough specificity, a named individual, a named institution, documented public visibility, that Stowe had moved it up his priority list. He'd expedited the inquiry through the investigative unit, called in a standing relationship with the MP duty office. And by 9 o'clock that evening, there was a preliminary determination that the complaint had sufficient grounds to warrant formal action under federal stolen valor statutes, federal charges, federal response, MPS, not local police. Nobody called Nora to inform her of any of this. She found out the following morning in the only way nobody ever plans for. She'd noticed the pulse oximeter in her bag when she got home the previous evening. She'd used it during a patient assessment near the end of her shift, tucked it into her pocket when she took the patient to imaging, and then somehow carried it out in the chaos of the day's final hour. It was a small piece of equipment, easily replaced, but it belonged to the department, and Nora was constitutionally incapable of leaving that unaddressed. She called the charge nurse at 7 a.m. to say she was bringing it back. She drove to Harlow. She parked in the visitor lot because she no longer had staff access. She walked in through the main entrance with the equipment in a small bag and had just set it on the trauma cart near reception, flagging down an orderly to hand it off, when the automatic doors opened behind her. She heard boots before she turned around. 4 MPs, 2 in front, 2 flanking. The formation was clean and practiced. The lobby went quiet the way lobbies go quiet when something visually wrong is happening in the middle of them. The particular silence of people who have stopped what they were doing because what they're seeing doesn't fit the category of things that happen in this place. The lead officer stopped 3 feet from her. He was young, late 20s, possibly, with a serious face and the specific discomfort of someone carrying out an assignment he hasn't fully reconciled. He read from a document in his hand, his voice loud enough to carry to every corner of the lobby. Nora Vance, you're under arrest on federal charges of fraudulent misrepresentation of military service under... May I see the documentation, she said. He stopped mid-sentence. Something shifted in his face. Recalibration. He held the document forward. She took it, read it fully, not skimming. Every line, every charge reference, every authorizing signature. Phones were coming out all around her. She could feel the lobby reorganizing itself around this event, the way it had reorganized itself around every other spectacle. Patients in the seating area turning to look, staff appearing in corridor doorways, a cluster of people near the elevators pulling their phones up and angling toward her. And somewhere at the edge of her peripheral vision, a figure in the corridor to the left with crossed arms and a particular stillness that she recognized without needing to look directly at it. She handed the document back. I'd like to make one phone call, she said. I'm legally entitled to it. You'll be given that opportunity at the facility, ma'am. I understand that. She held his gaze without pressure, without aggression, simply direct, simply clear. I'm requesting to make it now. It will take less than 2 minutes. The person I'm calling is a retired 4-star general, and I would strongly recommend not making this situation more complicated than it currently needs to be. The lead MP looked at the officer to his right, a half-second of something passing between them. Uncertainty, the slight vertigo of a situation behaving differently than expected. Make the call, he said. She reached into her jacket pocket with 2 fingers and produced a phone that seemed almost aggressively ordinary. A basic flip phone, battered at the corners, the kind of device that had stopped being common 15 years ago. She opened it, dialed a number without consulting anything, from pure memory, the fluid, unhesitating recall of someone who had dialed it in conditions considerably more difficult than a hospital lobby in Creston Falls. It rang twice, 3 times. Then a voice came through, male, low, unhurried, in the way of someone who had operated in enough emergencies to have stopped performing urgency. The voice of someone for whom this kind of call, at this kind of hour, was not unfamiliar territory. Walker. Not a question, just her name, placed like an acknowledgement. Sir. She kept her voice even, though the lobby was quiet enough now that the people nearest to her could hear both sides of it if they were paying attention, and they were. I'm at Harlow Veterans Medical Center in Creston Falls, Washington. I've been placed under arrest, stolen Valor charges. A silence that lasted exactly 2 seconds. Not surprised, she was certain of that. The pause of someone who has received bad news before and knows how to handle the first 2 seconds of it. Say nothing else, the voice said. To anyone. Not one word. I'll handle this. Copy that. She closed the phone, slid it back into her pocket, held out her wrists. The cuffs were cold and the click they made was very loud in the silence of the lobby. Around her, she could feel the weight of every phone that was recording. Could feel, the way you feel a crowd's attention as a physical thing, dozens of perspectives converging on this single point. From the left corridor, the figure with crossed arms had not moved. Dr. Marcus Hale was watching with an expression that was, underneath its surface composure, not quite as settled as he probably believed it looked. She did not look at him. She looked forward, at the automatic doors, at the gray November morning beyond them, the Creston Falls sky low and pale, a morning that looked like all other mornings. She let the MPs guide her toward the exit, and she walked through those doors with her hands in cuffs and her chin level and her face carrying the absolute stillness of someone who has already been somewhere much harder than this. Not because she wasn't angry, she was in the deep, contained way of someone who has learned to store anger rather than spend it. Not because she was unafraid of what the next hours would bring, but because she had, in her life before Harlow, before Creston Falls, before any of this, operated in environments where the cost of losing composure was measured in things far more irreversible than a career or a reputation. She knew what she had done. She knew who she was. And she knew, with the specific certainty of someone who had made the right call at the right moment, that the person on the other end of that phone call was already moving. The cruiser doors shut. The vehicles pulled out of the parking lot and into the Creston Falls morning. And in the lobby of Harlow Veterans Medical Center, every person who had just recorded what they believed was justice being carried out stood holding their phones, watching the footage they'd captured, convinced they understood what they had just seen. Not one of them had any idea what they had just started. Not one of them had any idea what they had just started. The VA Regional Holding Facility was a low building on the industrial side of Creston Falls, 12 minutes from Harlow by the route the MPs took, which avoided the downtown corridor and its noon traffic. Nora sat in the back of the cruiser and watched the city move past the window. A dry cleaner, a tire shop, a Vietnamese restaurant with its neon sign still dark at this hour, a school crossing guard standing at an empty intersection, and she did not speak because she had been told not to, and because there was genuinely nothing useful to say. The officer in the passenger seat glanced back at her twice during the drive. The second time, she met his eyes briefly and then returned her gaze to the window. He faced forward again and didn't look back a third time. At the facility, she was processed with the particular impersonal efficiency of a system that handles people by category. Photograph, fingerprints, property inventory, her phone, her keys, her jacket, a small notebook she kept in her breast pocket with 4 lines of patient notes from the previous day still written in it. The officer handling intake asked her 3 times if she wanted an attorney, which was correct procedure. She said yes each time, also correct procedure, and gave no other information. She was placed in a holding room that smelled of industrial cleaner and something older underneath it, and she sat at the metal table and waited. She was not good at waiting in the way that some people are good at waiting, the meditative kind, the restful kind. She was good at it in a different way, the functional way, the way of someone who had spent enough time in situations where waiting was operationally required and losing your composure during it cost you something real. She sat with her hands flat on the table and her back straight and let the room be what it was. Outside, Creston Falls was having a different kind of morning entirely. The video from the lobby had been posted by 3 separate people before the cruisers even cleared the hospital parking lot. The quality varied. One shaky phone shot from near the elevators, one clearer angle from near the reception desk, one partial view from the corridor that caught mostly the back of Nora's head and the faces of the MPs. But together they assembled a complete picture, and the picture spread. By the time Nora was being fingerprinted, the combined view count across the 3 clips had passed 80,000. By the time she was sitting at the metal table in the holding room, it was approaching 200,000, and the comment sections had become the particular kind of ecosystem that develops when a story catches fire before any facts have been verified. People were certain. That was the thing that happened fastest. Not the sharing, but the certainty. Complete strangers posting with the absolute conviction of eyewitnesses, making declarative statements about a woman they had never encountered in a city some of them couldn't have located on a map. Caught red-handed. Finally. Should have happened sooner. Disgrace to real veterans. The phrase stolen valor appeared in some variation in nearly every thread, repeated until it had become not an accusation but a verdict. And verdicts, once delivered by enough voices at once, have a way of feeling like established fact. At Harlow, the morning continued in the way mornings do after something seismic. Everyone still moving, still performing the functions of the institution, but with a new and charged undertone running through everything. Patients were seen, charts were updated, procedures went forward, but in the break room, in the corridors between bays, in the brief exchanges that happened between colleagues during shift transitions, the topic moved through the department like weather. Brianna Solis was not handling it well. She'd seen the clips. She'd read the comments. She'd spent the first hour after Nora's arrest doing her job with her jaw set and her phone face down in her pocket, and the second hour doing her job with her phone face up and the comment count climbing, and by the third hour she was sitting in the break room during a 12-minute gap between patients with a cup of coffee she hadn't touched, and a look on her face that her colleague Darnell, coming in to refill his water bottle, clocked immediately. "You okay?" he said. "No." She didn't elaborate. He sat down across from her. Darnell had been in the ED for 6 years, long enough to know most things about most people in the department, and observant enough to have noticed, over 14 months, that Brianna and Nora had developed the particular low-key solidarity of 2 people who'd worked enough difficult shifts together that they'd stopped needing to explain things to each other. "You knew her better than most of us," he said. "I don't know if I knew her at all," Brianna said. "That's the thing. She never talked about herself. I thought she was private. I didn't think—" She stopped. "She wasn't scared in there when they arrested her. I was watching, and she wasn't scared. She was just—" She made a gesture with her hand that meant something she couldn't put words to. "Calm," Darnell said. "Calm like she's done it before, or something like it." Brianna finally picked up her coffee, set it back down. "Hale's been in the surgeon's lounge all morning, and I swear to God if I have to walk past that room one more time and hear him talking—" "Don't," Darnell said simply. "Just don't walk past it." That was easier said than navigated in a department that shared hallways, but Brianna understood the spirit of the advice. She stood up, left her untouched coffee, and went back to work. In the surgeon's lounge, Marcus Hale was not, to be accurate, triumphant. He was something more complicated and less self-aware than that. He was telling the story, the confrontation at the nursing station, the dog tags, the refusal to answer questions, in the way that people tell stories that have been publicly validated, with the particular energy of someone whose private conviction has been confirmed by outside events. 2 other attending physicians listened. One asked a few questions. Nobody pushed back. What Hale did not do, that morning or at any point, was revisit the conversation with Stowe and consider whether the framing he had used, the word claim, the phrase unable to provide any answers, had been precise. He had been certain enough at the time. And certainty, once extended, becomes difficult to retract without also retracting something about yourself. The public defender assigned to Nora arrived at the holding facility at 11:15 a.m. Her name was Sandra Osei, 40-something, brisk and efficient, with a briefcase that had a broken clasp she'd been meaning to fix for 3 months. She'd been assigned the case 40 minutes earlier and had spent the intervening time reading what was publicly available, which was considerable and almost uniformly unfavorable to her new client. She sat across the table from Nora and studied her for a moment before opening her briefcase. "You're either very guilty or you've been through something worse than this before," Osei said. "People who sit the way you're sitting don't usually end up in this room." "I served in a classified special operations medical unit," Nora said. "My record is partially sealed by federal order. I can provide what's releasable. The rest I can't discuss." Osei wrote something. "That's going to be a difficult defense to build in a public environment." "I know. You said on the phone call she told before your arrest that you called a retired 4-star general." "Yes." "Who?" Nora looked at her steadily. "That information is also part of what I can't discuss in a context like this. What I can tell you is that the call was made, and that I was told the situation would be handled." Osei set down her pen. "Ms. Vance, I understand that you may have resources I'm not aware of, but right now, in this room, I am your attorney, and I need more than that to work with." "I know." Nora's voice was even. "I'm not trying to be difficult. I'm telling you what I'm able to tell you." "Can you give me a timeline?" "Of what?" "Of how long, realistically, whatever you've set in motion is going to take to arrive." Nora considered this. It was, she acknowledged privately, the right question. "I don't know exactly. It depends on how quickly certain parties can be reached and how quickly verification can be processed through the appropriate channels. Federal bureaucracy moves at its own speed." "Federal bureaucracy," Osei repeated, writing again. "Right." She closed her briefcase, the broken clasp catching, requiring a second attempt. "Okay, here's what we do. We say nothing, we make no public statements, we deny nothing, and confirm nothing. We wait." She looked at Nora. "Can you do that?" "Yes," Nora said. "Waiting is something I can do." What none of them knew, not Osei, not Stowe at the VA office, not Hale in the surgeon's lounge, not Patricia Odom reviewing the situation from her third-floor office with 3 monitors and an increasing number of calls from people who wanted the hospital to make a statement, was that the phone call from the holding facility lobby had been received by a man named General Thomas Briard, retired, who had upon hanging up immediately made 4 calls of his own. The first was to a former colleague at the Department of Defense. The second was to the Judge Advocate General's office. The third was to a woman named Colonel Lena Park, who was currently stationed in Virginia and whose security clearance was several levels above anything Gerald Stowe had ever had occasion to process. The fourth was to his personal attorney, who had, over 20 years, handled matters considerably more complex than a wrongful federal arrest. Each of these calls was brief. Each of them set something in motion, and none of the things being set in motion were visible yet from Creston Falls, Washington, which was continuing to move through its Tuesday afternoon under the impression that it understood what was happening. The hospital's social media accounts had, by 2 p.m. been flooded to a degree that required the communications department to close the comment functions on 4 different posts. Patricia Odom had given a brief statement, carefully worded, saying nothing specific, expressing the hospital's commitment to the integrity of the veteran community, and noting that an investigation was underway. And the statement had been torn apart in comment sections with the particular enthusiasm reserved for institutional language that people read as evasive. A reporter from the Creston Falls Courier had called the main line twice. A producer from a regional television station had called once. Odom sat in her office at 3 p.m. and looked at her monitors and thought, with the methodical clarity that had gotten her through 2 previous crises, about what she actually knew versus what she was operating on. What she knew, a nurse had been arrested on federal charges. What she was operating on, the accumulated social pressure of several 100,000 people who had decided, based on a 22-second clip, that justice had been served. Those were not the same thing, and Patricia Odom had been around long enough to know they were not the same thing, and knowing that wasn't making the afternoon any easier. She called her chief of staff into the office. His name was Raymond Cho. Young, meticulous, not yet experienced enough in institutional crisis management to have developed the useful habit of remaining calm when things went wrong. "I need to know," she said to him, "whether anyone in this hospital verified Nora Vance's credentials before her employment." "Standard HR verification was completed," he said. "References checked. License confirmed. Competency assessments clear. Military background check." He paused. "We don't That's not a standard component of our hiring process for non-military specific roles. It should be, given our patient population. She said it not accusatorially, but as a note to herself for later. All right, what about Hale? Has anyone spoken to him formally since this morning? He submitted a written account of the incident to HR at noon. Get me a copy. He left. She turned back to her monitors and read, for the fourth time, the statement she had drafted and not yet released, and found it for the fourth time insufficient, but couldn't identify what to add because what she needed to add was information she didn't have. Outside Creston Falls, 13 miles east on State Route 14, a charter bus carrying 47 high school students and 4 adult chaperones from a regional music festival in Pendleton, Oregon, had been traveling for 2 hours and 20 minutes when the left front tire blew at highway speed. The driver, a contracted employee named Walt, 56 years old and thoroughly experienced, who had driven this route many times, did everything correctly in the first second and a half. He didn't brake hard. He steered into the skid. He kept his hands on the wheel through the first fishtail and the second one. He was doing everything right until the bus crossed the center line and the rear caught the guardrail on the right shoulder. And the rail didn't give the way it should have because it was a section that had been flagged for replacement 6 months earlier and hadn't been replaced yet. And the rear of the bus swung wide and the whole vehicle went over the embankment at 42 miles per hour. It came to rest on its side in a drainage ditch at the base of a 15-foot slope, nose down, the roof partially crushed on the left side where it had caught a culvert. The first 911 call came in at 3:47 p.m. By 3:51, Creston Falls Fire and EMS were rolling. By 3:54, Harlow's ED charge nurse had been notified of an incoming mass casualty event. Number of victims unknown, severity unknown, ETA unknown, which was the specific combination of unknowns that activated the MCI protocol. Staff who were off shift were called back. Attending physicians were pulled from non-emergency procedures. Supply carts were repositioned. The trauma bays were cleared and reassigned. The first ambulance arrived at Harlow at 4:18 p.m. with 3 critical patients. The second arrived 4 minutes later with 5 more. By 4:35, 6 ambulances had made the run, and a 7th was being loaded at the scene, and the ED had 22 patients in various states of critical, serious, and moderate condition, with an unknown number still being extracted from the wreckage. The crush of it was immediate and physical. The noise, the controlled chaos of 17 staff members trying to be in 8 places simultaneously, the particular overwhelming quality of a mass casualty event that no amount of protocol preparation fully replicates in practice. Dr. Hale was in the building. He had been finishing paperwork when the notification came, and he'd moved to the ED the way all available physicians did. Because when a bus goes over an embankment and dozens of people are coming through your doors, the question of what you were doing before is irrelevant. He was competent in a crisis. Whatever else was true about him, that was true. And he moved into the controlled chaos of the trauma bays with the practiced authority of a surgeon who had worked mass casualty events before. But there were 22 patients, then 25. Then 31 as the later ambulances arrived with victims who had seemed stable at the scene and were not, in fact, stable. The attending physicians were spread thin, the residents were overextended. A third-year resident named Kaufman, working Bay 6, made an error in the chaos. Not catastrophic, but serious. A triage classification that misread a patient's respiratory status and delayed intervention by 4 minutes that the patient couldn't really spare. The charge nurse caught it, corrected it, but the correction cost time and the time cost attention elsewhere. At 4:52 p.m., with 31 patients in the department and 4 physicians running on the edge of their capacity, the charge nurse, a veteran of the department named Rosario, who had been in emergency nursing for 19 years and had a reliable instinct for when a situation was moving toward the edge of what a system could handle, picked up the phone and called an outside number. It was not standard procedure. It was not in the protocol. It was, as she would explain to Patricia Odom 2 days later, a judgment call made by someone who had enough experience to trust her judgment. She called Nora Vance. The holding facility allowed 1 outgoing call per detainee per 4-hour period. Nora had made her call. Receiving calls was a different matter, and the duty officer who answered the facility's general line and received the message from the Harlow ED charge nurse had a brief, visible internal conflict before deciding that a mass casualty event at the hospital where a detainee used to work was, probably, an unusual enough circumstance to warrant passing the message along. Nora came to the door of the holding room at 5:02 p.m. and was told by a young MP who looked genuinely uncomfortable with the situation that a nurse at Harlow Veterans Medical Center had called to inform her that a mass casualty event was underway and that the department was overwhelmed. She stood in the doorway for a moment. "I need to go," she said. "Ma'am, you're in federal custody." "I know that." Her voice was completely level. "I'm not asking to be released from custody. I'm asking to be transported to Harlow Veterans Medical Center so I can assist with a mass casualty event. You can keep the cuffs on. You can keep an officer with me at all times. I'm asking to help people who need help." The MP looked at her. "I can't authorize that." "Then get me someone who can." He got the duty commander. The duty commander, whose name was Captain Fielding, was a practical man who had been in the military long enough to understand that unusual situations required unusual decisions, and who also understood practically that if he refused to allow a medical professional to assist in a mass casualty event and people died as a result, the paperwork associated with that outcome was going to be considerably worse than whatever paperwork resulted from allowing her to go. He made the call in 4 minutes. At 5:11 p.m., Nora Vance arrived at Harlow Veterans Medical Center for the second time that day. She arrived in the back of an MP vehicle. She arrived with her wrists uncuffed. Fielding had decided practically that an emergency nurse needed her hands, and with 2 MPs accompanying her, one on each side, which was the compromise that satisfied the requirement of federal custody while allowing her to do what she'd come to do. She walked through the ED doors, and the department received her the way departments receive unexpected resources in the middle of a crisis. With instant, instinctive utility, no one having time to process the circumstances, just the immediate recognition of a capable person walking into a space that desperately needed capable people. Rosario met her at the threshold with a look that communicated, in the compressed language of emergency nursing colleagues, approximately 12 things at once. "Bay 3 is behind," Rosario said. "Pediatric, 12 years old, blunt abdominal trauma. BP's dropping and Kaufman's tied up in 1. Nora was already moving. "Who else?" "Bay 7 has a spinal precaution that needs reassessment. The first read was wrong. Bay 11 is a chest that might be more than a chest, and we have 3 critical still inbound." "Who's running the board?" "Nobody right now. I've been doing it from the desk." Nora looked at the board, the whiteboard status system that tracked patient location, acuity, and assigned staff across the department. She looked at it for approximately 4 seconds. The 2 MPs who had accompanied her had stopped just inside the door, and they stood there with the particular stillness of people who are trying to figure out where they fit in an environment that has no role for them. "Bay 3 first," Nora said, and went. What happened over the next 90 minutes was not cinematic in the way emergency medicine gets portrayed in film and television. The running, the dramatic shouted orders, the single heroic moment that saves everything. Real mass casualty management is more granular and more exhausting than that. It is dozens of small decisions made in compressed timeframes, each one consequential, the whole of it requiring a particular kind of mental architecture that most people, trained or otherwise, can't sustain under the accumulated weight of it. Nora sustained it. She reassessed the 12-year-old in Bay 3 and caught a splenic laceration that the initial evaluation had graded low and that the child's dropping pressure was now indicating was considerably more significant. She flagged it for immediate surgical consult, gave Rosario 3 specific instructions about fluid management, and was in Bay 7 within 4 minutes. The spinal precaution in Bay 7 had been applied correctly, but the reassessment parameters had been set for the wrong mechanism of injury. She corrected them, notified the attending, moved on. Bay 11 was a 40-year-old woman whose chest film looked like a contusion, but whose breath sounds on the left were inconsistent with that reading in a way that suggested something accumulating. Nora flagged it for a second look and stood at the bedside talking the woman through a breathing assessment while simultaneously updating the status board with her left hand. And the attending who came to Bay 11 12 minutes later confirmed a small hemothorax that the initial read had missed. She didn't run. She moved at the specific pace of someone who understands that running wastes energy and communicates panic to patients, neither of which is useful. She didn't raise her voice. She gave clear, specific instructions and expected them to be followed, and they were. because there is a quality to competent authority in a crisis that people recognize and respond to without being able to articulate exactly why. At one point, Dr. Hale, crossing from Bay 2 to Bay 5, stopped in the corridor and looked at her. She was at the status board, updating, her back to him. She was directing a resident on the phone in Bay 4 through a medication protocol while simultaneously reading a chart handed to her by a passing nurse and tracking the arrival notification on the radio at the desk. 3 distinct streams of attention managed simultaneously, the way a person manages them when that particular kind of multitasking has been trained into them under conditions far more demanding than this. Hale stood there for 4 seconds. Then he went to Bay 5. But his face, in those 4 seconds, had been doing something he probably wouldn't have wanted anyone to see. At 6:23 p.m., the third-to-last incoming patient arrived. He was a 16-year-old male, extracted from the rear of the bus, who had initially been classified as stable at the scene and had deteriorated in transit in the specific way that certain traumatic injuries deteriorate, slowly, then suddenly. He arrived in Bay 8 with a blood pressure that had no business being where it was for someone his age, a respiratory rate that was climbing, and a level of consciousness that was dropping. The resident assigned to Bay 8 was a second-year named Torres, who was competent and genuinely skilled, but who had never, in his 2 years of residency, been the primary on a patient crashing this fast without an attending immediately available, and who was in the specific position of knowing what he was looking at, but not having the certainty to act on it alone. Nora came through the Bay 8 curtain at 6:24. She read Torres's face before she read the monitors. She read the monitors before she read the chart. She put her hand on the patient's abdomen, carefully, specifically, in 3 locations, and then she straightened up and said to Torres with a precision that was almost cold, "Tension pneumo, right side. Get me a large bore needle, 14 gauge, second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line. Now." Torres blinked. The chest film is 7 minutes old and he's crashing. Get the needle." He got the needle. The procedure Nora performed in the next 90 seconds, a needle thoracostomy, decompressing a tension pneumothorax that had developed from what had initially appeared to be a minor chest wall contusion, was correct, was necessary, and was executed with a technical precision and a specific tactical efficiency that made Torres, watching, feel something he would have difficulty describing later. It wasn't just skill. It was the quality of someone for whom this procedure was not operating room familiar, but something older, more ingrained, learned in a context where the alternative to getting it right was not a bad outcome on a chart, but something immediate and irreversible. The patient's oxygen saturation, which had been at 81 and dropping, climbed to 91 within 40 seconds. His blood pressure, which had been 74 over palp, began to recover. Torres exhaled. Nora stripped her gloves, handed them off, and turned toward the curtain. "How did you—" Torres started. "Document everything," she said, "including the timeline." She stepped through the curtain. The 2 MPs, who had been standing near the nursing station for the past 90 minutes with nothing to do and no useful role in the situation, were watching her. The one on the left, the younger one, who had glanced at her twice in the cruiser, was doing it with an expression that had changed considerably from the one he'd worn during the arrest. Rosario was at the desk. She looked at Nora and didn't say anything for a moment, just looked, and then said, "3 more coming down from recovery upstairs. Can you—" "Yes," Nora said. From Bay 2, on the other side of the department, Dr. Marcus Hale emerged to consult on a vascular case and stopped for a moment in the open corridor. The department was beginning, slightly, to find its balance. Not calm, not even close, but the specific quality of controlled forward motion that replaces pure chaos when enough competent people have been at something long enough. And at the center of that motion, coordinating and assessing and moving and deciding, was the woman he had publicly accused that morning. He stood there. He didn't say anything to anyone. He went back into Bay 2. At 7:31 p.m., with the immediate crisis managed, and the department beginning the slower work of stabilization and transfer planning, Nora walked back to where the 2 MPs were standing and said quietly, "I think I'm ready to go back now." The one on the left, the younger one, said, "Yes, ma'am." And then, after a half-second, almost involuntarily, "Good work in there." She looked at him. The acknowledgement seemed to reach her in a way that very little else had that day. Something shifted in her face, briefly. Something human and tired. And then it was gone. "Thank you," she said. She followed them to the door, and Rosario, watching from the desk, noticed something that she would mention later to Brianna, in the break room, in the specific tone of someone who has witnessed something they don't entirely know how to categorize. She saved at least 4 of them tonight, maybe more, if you count the ones that get counted later. And she walked out of here in the same situation she walked in. Brianna, who had been there for 3 hours of the event, and had watched Nora from across the department with the complicated mix of relief and grief and something like awe that the situation produced, said nothing for a moment. Then, "What did Hale do?" Rosario considered. "His job," she said. "He did his job." She paused. She did something else. In the MP vehicle heading back to the holding facility, Nora sat in the back and looked out the window at the Creston Falls night. The city was dark now, the streetlights doing their flat work against the sky, the usual traffic moving through the usual intersections. She was tired in the physical way. Her feet, her shoulders, the particular tension that lives in the jaw after hours of sustained focus. She had not eaten since 6 that morning. She had been arrested, held, transported, worked a mass casualty event in federal custody, and was now being returned to a holding room where she would wait for a process to resolve itself on a timeline she couldn't control. She pressed her fingers lightly against the bead chain at her throat. The tags were still there. They had been there this entire day the way they had been there for years. Present, unremarked by her, simply part of what she carried. Her phone was still in the property inventory at the facility. She hadn't been able to check whether Briard had sent word. She didn't know what was happening on the legal side, what the timeline was, whether anything was moving. What she knew was that she had done what she could do today with the situation she was in, and that the rest was not in her control, and that you could either spend your energy on what wasn't in your control or you could save it. She saved it. The vehicle stopped at a red light 3 blocks from the facility. On the corner, a convenience store lit up against the dark. A woman outside it on her phone with a grocery bag on her arm. A man walking a dog that had stopped to investigate something in the gutter. Ordinary Tuesday. Ordinary night. Nora looked at it and thought, briefly, about the 16-year-old in Bay 8. His name had been on the wristband she'd read during the procedure. Daniel. She didn't know his last name. She didn't know if he had siblings or what he'd been doing at the music festival or whether he played an instrument. She knew he was alive because she'd been in that room at that moment. And she knew that tomorrow or the day after, his parents would be in a hospital hallway, somewhere receiving information about what had happened to him and what had saved him, and they would not know her name. That was fine. That had always been fine with her. It was the work that mattered, not the accounting of it. The light changed. The vehicle moved. At the facility, she was returned to the holding room and the door was closed, and she sat back at the metal table with her hands flat on the surface and waited. She was still sitting there 40 minutes later when she heard, from somewhere down the corridor, carrying through the facility's institutional quiet, the sound of voices. Not loud, not raised, but multiple voices, official voices, the kind that move through buildings differently than regular conversation. Then footsteps. Then the specific sound of a door being opened with administrative authority rather than routine procedure. And then Captain Fielding appeared in the doorway of the holding room with an expression that Nora read in approximately 1 second and that told her, before he said a single word, that the thing Thomas Briard had set in motion that morning had arrived. Behind Fielding, she could see the edge of a uniform, not an MP uniform, something else entirely. Behind Fielding, she could see the edge of a uniform, not an MP uniform, something else entirely. The uniform belonged to a woman, Colonel Lena Park, as it turned out, though Nora didn't know that name yet. She was compact, perhaps 50, with the particular posture of someone who had spent decades in rooms where posture communicated rank before rank insignia did. She wore no expression that could be easily categorized. She stepped past Fielding into the holding room the way people step into spaces they've assessed before entering, and she looked at Nora with the specific attention of someone cross-referencing what they see against information they already have. Behind Park came 2 men in civilian clothes who moved like they weren't civilian. And behind them, partially obscured by the doorframe, a third figure who stopped in the corridor rather than entering, older, broad-shouldered, in a dark jacket over a collared shirt. The The kind of man who generates a gravitational field in any room he's adjacent to without apparently doing anything to produce it. Nora's eyes found him through the doorframe. He found hers at the same moment. General Thomas Briard had aged since she'd last seen him. Deeper lines at the jaw, hair gone fully white that had been gray before, but the quality that had always defined him, the compressed authority of someone who had operated at altitude for 40 years, was entirely intact. He gave her a look that communicated something close to relief and something close to anger in equal measure. The specific combination that people produce when someone they care about has been put through something unnecessary. He did not come into the room. Park spoke first. "Ms. Vance, I'm Colonel Park, Judge Advocate General's office. I need to inform you that as of 37 minutes ago, the federal charges filed against you under stolen valor statutes have been formally suspended pending review. You are not being released from those charges. They are suspended, which means the investigation continues, but your detention does not." Nora looked at her. "On what basis?" "On the basis that the service record used to evaluate your claimed veteran status was an incomplete file, a standard civilian access record that does not reflect the totality of your documented military history." Park paused. "The fuller record is classified at a level that the VA Regional Investigative Unit does not have clearance to access. That gap produced a verification failure. It was not, the JAG office has determined, your failure." Captain Fielding, standing in the doorway, had the expression of a man absorbing something he would be processing for several days. "My property," Nora said, "will be returned to you at the front desk." Park looked at her a moment longer. "There will be additional process. This isn't over formally, but you're not spending tonight here." Nora nodded once. She stood, pushed the chair back under the table, straightened her jacket, and then she walked to the door, and Thomas Briard stepped back from the frame to let her pass, and she stopped in front of him in the corridor, and they looked at each other for a moment with the complicated shorthand of two people who have shared something that most people haven't and who don't require much language to communicate about it. "You look terrible," he said. "It's been a long day," she said. "I know what kind of day it was." Something moved in his expression. All of it. She understood from that he'd been informed about the mass casualty event, about the ED, about what she'd done while technically in federal custody. She didn't know how he'd found out, but she wasn't surprised that he had. "I was there," she said. "It needed doing." "It always does with you." He said it without sentimentality, more like an observation about a consistent pattern. "Can you walk?" "I've been sitting down for 4 hours. Yes, I can walk." He almost smiled. "Come on." The night air outside the facility was cold and specific, the kind of eastern Washington cold that arrived in late autumn with no particular announcement, just a temperature drop that made the air feel used differently in the lungs. Nora stood on the front steps for a moment and breathed it in, which was less a dramatic gesture than a simple physiological response to having been in a sealed room for most of the day. A black SUV waited at the curb. Briard opened the door for her and then got in the other side, and Colonel Park and one of the civilian-clothed men got into a second vehicle behind them. The driver, young, silent, military, pulled into the Creston Falls night without being told where to go. "Tell me what happened," Briard said. Not the arrest, she understood. He knew the arrest. He meant before it. She told him about Hale, the nursing station, the dog tags, the questions she hadn't answered, the clip Devon had posted. She told it without editorializing, just sequence and fact, the way she'd been trained to report things. Briard listened without interrupting, which was one of his qualities, the ability to actually listen rather than wait to respond. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "He served," he said. "Hale. You know that." "I know. That's going to matter to people. When this resolves, I know that too. How are you thinking about him?" She considered the question seriously, which was the only way she knew how to consider things. He saw something that looked like a lie and acted on it. The way he acted on it was wrong, but the thing he was trying to protect was real. She looked out the window at the passing city. That doesn't make it okay. It just makes it human. Briard was quiet again. Then, "You did a needle decompression in a hospital ED while under federal arrest with 2 MPs watching. The patient needed it. Torres, the resident, called it in to the attending as a teaching moment. Apparently he's been talking about the procedure for 3 hours. Nora said nothing. Your technique, Briard said, with the careful inflection of someone choosing words precisely, was identified by the attending who reviewed the case as consistent with combat medical protocol rather than standard civilian ER procedure. That observation has been formally noted. She turned from the window and looked at him. By whom? By Dr. Elliot Marsh, Chief of Emergency Medicine at Harlow, who filed an incident report at 9 p.m. this evening. He met her eyes. The report notes that the patient, Daniel Rourke, 16 years of age, would likely not have survived to surgical intervention without immediate bedside decompression, and that the person who performed that decompression demonstrated a level of tactical medical competency that goes beyond standard nursing certification. Nora looked at him for a long moment. Where are we going? She said. Hotel. You need to sleep. Tomorrow's going to be complicated. More complicated than today? Differently complicated, he said. Today was defense. Tomorrow starts moving in the other direction. She understood what he meant. She turned back to the window and watched Creston Falls slide past, the gas stations and the apartment buildings and the school she drove past every morning on her way to Harlow. All of it the same as it had always been, the city unchanged by what had happened inside it today. Cities didn't know. They just continued. She fell asleep in the vehicle before they reached the hotel, her head against the cold glass, which was not dignified, and which she would have been mildly embarrassed about if she'd been awake to notice it. Briard saw it happen and told the driver to take the longer route. The next morning arrived with the aggressive clarity of a cold November day with no cloud cover. Sharp light, sharp shadows, the kind of morning that looked decisive whether anything decisive was actually happening or not. It was happening. At 7 a.m., 3 black military SUVs pulled into the parking structure adjacent to Harlow Veterans Medical Center. Their occupants were not announced. They didn't go through the main entrance. Colonel Park had arranged access through the administrative wing, and she moved through it now with 2 attorneys from the JAG office and a documentation specialist from the DOD, all of them carrying things that needed to be reviewed and several things that needed to be served. Patricia Odom received them in her office at 7:14 and had the specific expression of someone who had not slept well and was now being handed something much larger than they'd expected at this hour. She read the first document, read it again, then set it down and said, with the careful composure of a person managing a considerable recalibration in real time, I need my legal counsel in this room. Of course, Park said. We'll wait. Outside Odom's office, in the corridor, a different kind of arrival was happening simultaneously. General Thomas Briard came through the front entrance of Harlow Veterans Medical Center at 7:31 a.m. He came through it the way he moved through most spaces, but without performance, without announcement, without any quality that was theatrical. He was simply present, and his presence was the kind that reconfigured rooms without requiring the room's permission. He was accompanied by 2 people. A woman named Margaret Sue, who was his personal attorney and who had been working on 4 hours of sleep and showed it in a way she wouldn't have shown under other circumstances, and a former special operations officer named Reyes, who had no official role in the proceedings and whose presence was simply Briard, being the kind of person who didn't walk into uncertain situations without someone he trusted at his shoulder. He did not go to the administrative wing. He went to the emergency department. He found it in the morning state of a department that had run a mass casualty event the previous afternoon. Depleted, reorganizing, running on the specific energy of staff who were tired in their bones but couldn't stop yet. He stood at the threshold of the department for a moment, reading it the way he read every environment he entered, assessing. Rosario was at the desk. She looked up and saw Briard, and did not immediately know who he was, but she knew, in the instinctive way of someone who'd worked in and around military medicine for 2 decades, what he was. She said carefully, "Can I help you, sir?" "I'm looking for the attending who filed the incident report last night," Briard said. "Dr. Marsh. He's on rounds. I can page him." "Please." Elliot Marsh arrived 7 minutes later, 50s, unhurried, with the particular quality of an experienced emergency physician who had seen enough surprises in his career that new ones registered as information rather than disruption. He looked at Briard and said, "You're here about Nora Vance." "I am." "Then let's find somewhere to sit down." They found a family consultation room off the main corridor, small, with a round table and 4 chairs and a box of tissues on the windowsill that nobody moved. Briard sat. Marsh sat across from him. Reyes stood by the door. "The incident report," Briard said. "I filed it because what happened in Bay 8 last night needed to be documented accurately," Marsh said. "A patient presented in extremis, the assigned resident identified the likely cause correctly, but hesitated at intervention, and a nurse who was technically under federal arrest at the time, performed a needle thoracostomy with a degree of technical precision and situational confidence that I would associate with combat medical experience rather than standard ED training." He said it straightforwardly, without drama. "Daniel Rourke is in the ICU this morning. His prognosis is good. That is directly attributable to what happened in Bay 8. Apoy? Is that in the report?" "In those words, yes." Briard was quiet for a moment. "What do you know about Nora Vance's background? Before yesterday? What she put on her application? Army? Served? No specifics." Marsh paused. "After last night, I know she has skills that don't come from a nursing program and don't come from any civilian trauma center. The way she ran that department during the MCO, I've worked with trauma surgeons who don't have that kind of organizational clarity under that kind of pressure." Another pause. "Which raises the question of what she actually did when she served, and why she couldn't say so." "That's the question," Briard agreed. "Are you going to answer it?" Briard looked at him. "I'm going to answer the parts I'm able to answer. That's why I'm here." What Briard told Elliot Marsh in the next 22 minutes was not, in its specifics, something that could be repeated outside that room. Not yet, not through informal channels. But in its broad shape, it was this. Nora Vance had served for 9 years in a classified special operations medical unit whose existence was not publicly acknowledged. During that service, she had deployed into active combat environments, had provided direct battlefield medical support to special operations personnel in circumstances that went significantly beyond the parameters of any nursing role the civilian world would recognize, and had received commendations that remained sealed because the operations that produced them remained classified. Her record, as accessed by the VA Regional Investigative Unit, was a partial file, the portion that could exist in unclassified systems. And that file, in the absence of the sealed portion, looked like a gap rather than a history. Marsh sat with this for a moment after Briard finished. "She's been here 14 months, he said. "Yes." "And the entire time, she knew that if anyone pushed hard enough on the dog tags, this exact situation could happen. She understood the risk. Why not request a transfer to a VA facility? She'd have been in a system where her record could be handled appropriately." "She prefers civilian hospitals," Briard said, and something in the way he said it suggested there was more to that preference than he was going to elaborate on. "She's been out for 4 years. She wanted to work in emergency medicine. She wanted a normal life as much as she was going to get one." Marsh looked at the table. "The board is meeting this afternoon," he said, "about her employment status. The public situation? The public situation is being addressed," Briard said. "That's the other thing I'm here to discuss." At 9 a.m., the situation Briard had described as being addressed arrived at Harlow with the specific force of something that had been building at federal speed and was now making contact with institutional reality. The document served to Patricia Odom's office included a formal verification of Nora Vance's military service from the DoD. Not the classified details, but a certification, signed at the appropriate level, confirming that her service was genuine, decorated, and had been incorrectly evaluated due to classification barriers. The documents also included a formal request from the JAG office that the hospital provide all records related to the decision to place Nora Vance on administrative leave, all communications between hospital administration and the VA regional office, and all internal records related to the complaint filed by Dr. Marcus Hale. Odom read this with her legal counsel beside her and did not say anything for a long time. "They're not filing against the hospital," her counsel said. "Not yet. This is a records request." "I know what it is," Odom said. "I also know what comes after it if the records show what I think they're going to show." "Which is?" "That we moved faster than we should have. That we responded to public pressure rather than verification protocol." She set the documents down. "Get me HR. Get me the head of medical staff credentialing. And get me Marcus Hale." Hale was paged to the administrative wing at 9:22 a.m. He arrived at 9:31, which was not particularly fast for someone who'd been in the building since 8, and he arrived with a quality of deliberate composure that Odom recognized as the particular composure of someone who had been thinking about what they were going to say and had arranged it in advance. He sat down across from her. Her counsel sat to her left. The documents were on the table between them. "Marcus," she said, "I need you to walk me through your call to Gerald Stowe at the VA regional office." A beat. Brief. Controlled. "I raised a concern I had about a staff member's credentials. I felt I had an obligation, given our patient population." "You felt you had an obligation?" Odom kept her voice even. "Did you make any attempt to address that concern through internal channels before calling an external federal contact?" Another beat. "I had the conversation at the nursing station. I gave her the opportunity to—" "Before that conversation, was there any formal process you initiated internally?" "No." "Did you contact HR?" "No." "Did you contact credentialing?" Silence for a moment. "No." Odom looked at him. Hale was a controlled man, and he was maintaining that control, but she could see something working underneath it. Not guilt exactly, not yet, but the first contact between his internal version of events and the possibility that those events were going to be evaluated from the outside according to standards that his internal version hadn't accounted for. "The DoD has provided formal verification of Ms. Vance's military service," Odom said. She pushed one of the documents across the desk. "Her record is genuine. It was partially sealed, which is why standard verification produced an incomplete result. The VA regional investigation was initiated based on insufficient information." Hale looked at the document. His jaw moved. "I acted on what I observed," he said. "You acted on what you concluded," Odom said. "There's a difference. And you acted on it by calling a federal contact rather than following any of the institutional processes that exist precisely for this situation." She paused. "I need you to understand that the records request we've just received covers all internal communications related to this matter, including yours." Hale looked up from the document. For the first time that morning, the first time really since the nursing station confrontation 2 days ago, something in his face was not entirely composed. It was small, the shift, a tightening around the eyes, a fractional compression of the jaw. But it was there. "I didn't fabricate anything," he said. "No," Odom agreed. "But fabrication isn't the only way to cause damage." She let that sit. At 10:15 a.m., Nora arrived at Harlow for the third time in 2 days. She arrived differently this time. She arrived in the front passenger seat of the first SUV, with Briard behind her in the back seat, and when the vehicle stopped at the main entrance and she got out, she was no longer wearing yesterday's clothes. She'd had an hour at the hotel after Briard woke her at 6, enough time to shower and change, not enough to fully process the cumulative weight of the past 30 hours. She looked, as Brianna Solis would note later, like someone who was functioning at full capacity while running on considerably less than full resources, which was accurate. She stood for a moment at the entrance. The morning was cold and bright, and the hospital's automatic doors were doing their usual work, opening and closing for the steady flow of the morning shift change. People going in and out looked at her. Several stopped. One resident, a woman from the internal medicine team named Kim, who had seen the original clip and then the arrest footage and then had been in the department the previous evening during the MCI, stopped on her way in and looked at Nora with an expression that was complicated and genuine and didn't resolve into anything simple. Then she held the door open. Nora walked through it. The ED was the first stop, which was Briard's plan and Odom's reluctant agreement. Nora needed to be present, physically present, in the space where the narrative of the past 2 days had its center of gravity, before anything formal could happen. You couldn't counter a story told in a place by staying out of the place. The department registered her arrival the way it had registered everything about her for 2 days, through the network of attention that moves through a hospital floor faster than any official communication. By the time she reached the nursing station, the department knew she was there. Rosario looked up from the desk and simply said, "Bay 8 patient is stable. His parents are upstairs. They've been asking." "Asking what?" "Asking who saved their kid." Nora set her bag down. "I'll go up. There's also—" Rosario hesitated. "Hale's in the building." "I know." "Are you—" "I'm fine." She picked up her bag. I'll be back in 20 minutes. She wasn't entirely fine, which Rosario could see and which Nora knew Rosario could see, but the acknowledgement of that was going to have to wait for a time when there were fewer things happening. She took the elevator to the 4th floor and found the room where Daniel Rourke's parents were sitting. His mother, Corinne, compact and dark-haired and still carrying the specific depletion of someone who had driven 4 hours through the night after a phone call that started with "Your son has been in an accident." And she stood in the doorway and said quietly, "I'm Nora Vance. I was in the ED last night." Corinne Rourke looked at her for a long moment. "You're the one," she said. It wasn't a question. Nora had learned, over years, that parents of patients who'd been told a specific person had intervened in a specific way at a specific moment had a way of looking at that person with a directness that bypassed normal social distance. There was nothing comfortable about it. It was simply the look of someone trying to make real something that their mind kept reformatting as too large. "He's going to be okay," Nora said. "The doctor told us." Corinne's husband, beside her, had his hand over his mouth. He'd been crying recently. He didn't appear embarrassed about it. "He told us if it had been another few minutes." "It wasn't," Nora said. "He made it." She paused. "He's a strong kid. You'll have a lot of years left to argue with him." Corinne laughed, a short, broken sound that was also relief. Then she stood up and crossed the room and took Nora's hand in both of hers, and Nora let her, standing still under the weight of someone else's gratitude, the way you stand still under something you're not entirely sure you deserve and are not going to argue with. She was back on the ground floor in 19 minutes. She found the corridor outside Odom's office occupied by things she hadn't expected. The first was Briard, standing outside the office door with Park and Margaret Sue and Raymond Cho, who looked like he'd been awake for 36 hours and was making poor decisions about his coffee consumption. The second was a man she didn't recognize, tall, late 50s, in military dress uniform, with rank insignia that placed him well above the level she'd been expecting at this stage of proceedings. Briard saw her come around the corner, and his expression changed in a way she read immediately as significant. "There's someone here," he said. "I can see that." "He flew in this morning when he heard the situation." Briard chose his next words with care. He insisted. The man in the dress uniform turned, and Nora went still. Not because she recognized his face, she'd never met him in person, but she recognized the stars on his shoulder, and she recognized his name from the nameplate on his chest. And she understood in one sudden reorganization of everything she'd been expecting about how this day was going to unfold that the situation had moved to a level she hadn't anticipated. He crossed the distance between them in 4 steps. Major General Warren Aldis, United States Army, commanding officer of a Special Operations Medical Program whose name was not spoken in public documentation, stopped in front of Nora Vance and drew himself fully upright and saluted her. The corridor was not empty. There were 6 people in it, plus 2 staff members who had appeared at the end of the hall and stopped, and Brianna Solis, who had come around the corner on her way to the supply room and who had also stopped, and through the glass panel of the door to the administrative waiting area, a group of 4 people who were watching through the glass without knowing how to stop watching. "Chief Walker," Aldis said. The title was not her current title. It was her former one, the rank she had held at the end of her service, the rank under which she had done the things that had earned her the sealed commendations and the classified record and the dog tags she wore on a worn chain under her scrubs. "It is an honor to be in the same building with you again." The corridor was absolutely silent. Nora held his gaze for a moment, a held breath of a moment, the kind that stretches while the brain performs a rapid recalibration of what has happened and what is still happening and what is about to happen. Then she said, in a voice that was steady but not quite even, the first time in 2 days that her voice had been not quite even, "Sir, you didn't have to—" "I came," he said simply. "That's all." At the end of the corridor, Brianna Solis had her hand over her mouth. In the administrative waiting area, through the glass, the 4 people were very still, and at the far end of the hall, having arrived in the corridor from a different direction at a different moment, having come from the direction of the stairwell, having stopped when he saw what was happening and not been able to make himself continue past it, Dr. Marcus Hale stood with his back against the wall and watched a 2-star general of the United States Army salute the woman he had publicly called a fraud. His face was doing something that had no clean name. It was not triumph. It was not relief. It was the specific and private expression of someone watching a version of reality that they had committed to publicly, professionally, and with genuine conviction in the moment, watching it come apart in front of them and understanding for the first time the full weight of what they had set in motion. Nora was looking at Aldous. Aldous was looking at Nora. And Briard, from his position slightly behind and to the left, was watching Hale's face across the length of the corridor with the quiet attention of someone noting something for later use. Odom's office door opened. Park stepped out with 2 documents in her hand and the expression of someone delivering the next phase of something that was already in motion. She looked at Nora, then at Aldous, then at Briard. She said carefully, "We're ready inside." Aldous lowered his salute. Nora straightened, adjusted her jacket, looked once, briefly, in the direction of where Hale was standing. A look that held no triumph and no anger, just a flat acknowledgement of his presence, a recognition that he was there and that what was happening was real and that he was watching it. And then she turned back to Park. "Let's go," she said, and she walked into the office. The door closed. In the corridor, Hale stood with his back against the wall, and the sound of his own breathing was the loudest thing he could hear. His phone buzzed in his pocket. He took it out. It was Gerald Stowe at the VA regional office, calling for the 4th time that morning, and something in the rhythm of those calls, 4 in 90 minutes, increasing in frequency, told him, without needing to answer, that the information moving through the federal system had now reached the level where people who had acted on his concern were beginning to understand what the concern had produced. His phone buzzed again. This time, it was a number he didn't recognize. He answered it. The voice on the other end identified itself as belonging to the office of the VA Inspector General, and it said, in the careful, measured language of federal process beginning to turn its attention toward a new direction. "Dr. Hale, we'd like to schedule a time to speak with you about the circumstances that led to the complaint filed regarding Nora Vance, at your earliest convenience." The corridor was empty now. Everyone had moved. The hospital continued around him, patients and staff, and the ordinary machinery of the institution, indifferent to the fact that one of its most prominent physicians was standing alone in a hallway with a phone to his ear and a version of the future that no longer looked like anything he'd planned for. "Of course," he said, into the phone. His voice was completely steady. His hands were not. His hands were not. The meeting in Odom's office lasted 2 hours and 14 minutes. Nora sat on one side of the conference table that Odom had pulled from the adjacent room to accommodate the number of people who needed to be present. Park and the 2 JAG attorneys on one side, Briard and Margaret Sue on the other, Aldous at the head, because nobody had suggested he sit anywhere else, and nobody was going to. Odom sat at her own desk slightly removed from the table, which was a positioning choice that communicated something about how she understood her role in this particular meeting, present, responsible, but not the center of gravity. Raymond Cho had been told to take notes and was doing so with the focused desperation of a man who understood that what was being said in this room would be consequential and did not want to be the person who failed to document it accurately. The documents Park laid out were precise and extensive. They covered, in formal language, the following: the nature of Nora's sealed service record, characterized in terms of clearance levels and operational classification without identifying specific operations. The gap in the verification system that had produced the incorrect assessment. The actions taken by Gerald Stowe at the VA regional office and the speed at which those actions had proceeded relative to standard investigative protocol. The role of the complaint filed by Marcus Hale in initiating that process. The subsequent arrest, the detention, the mass casualty event at which Nora had provided direct patient care while under federal custody. That last item, the mass casualty event, was presented not as incidental color, but as substantive documentation. Elliot Marsh's incident report was in the packet. So was Torres's written account of Bay 8. So was a formal statement from Captain Fielding at the holding facility describing the circumstances under which he had authorized Nora's temporary transport to the hospital and his observation of her conduct there. Odom read through the packet with the focused attention of someone who had been in administration long enough to understand that documents like this had purposes beyond their stated content. They were not just information, they were the architecture of what would come next. She finished reading, set the last page down, looked at Park. "What is the JAG office's position on this hospital's handling of the situation?" she said. Park was careful. "The office's position is that the hospital's procedural response, the administrative leave, was premature in the absence of completed verification. The speed of that response appears to have been influenced by external public pressure rather than internal process." She paused. "That's an institutional failure of the kind that generates liability. Whether the office pursues that formally will depend, in part, on what steps the hospital takes now." Odom absorbed this. "What steps are you looking for?" "Immediate reinstatement, full back pay for the period of suspension, a formal review of credentialing procedures for staff with classified military backgrounds." Park looked at her directly. "And a formal internal investigation into the conduct of the staff member whose complaint initiated this chain of events." The room was quiet. Nora had not said anything since sitting down. She was sitting with her hands folded on the table in front of her, and she was watching Odom, not the documents, not Park, not Briard. Watching Odom specifically because Odom was the person in the room whose decision actually governed the next 24 hours. And watching people's faces when they processed difficult information was the thing Nora had always done better than almost anything else. Odom looked at her. "Nora," she said. Not Ms. Vance, Nora, which was a small thing but not an insignificant one. "I owe you an apology. What I said to you when I placed you on leave, that it wasn't a judgment, that was technically accurate and practically wrong. The speed of what we did was a judgment, even if I didn't intend it that way." Nora said, "I know. I'm sorry. I know that too." It wasn't forgiveness, exactly. It was something more pragmatic, an acknowledgement that the apology was real, and that Nora had registered it, and that the relationship between the apology and the damage it was apologizing for was complicated and would take more than one morning to sort out. Odom seemed to understand that. She nodded once and turned back to Park. "Draft the reinstatement documentation," she said. "I'll sign it today." What Odom did not do that morning, and what Park had not explicitly required, was summon Marcus Hale into her office immediately. That meeting was coming. Odom knew it, Hale knew it, and by mid-morning the entire hospital had developed a collective awareness that it was coming, the way institutions develop awareness of things that haven't happened yet, but whose approach is legible in the changed quality of the air. But the morning's immediate business was Nora, and the documentation, and the beginning of what would be a long formal process, and so Hale remained in the building, performing his scheduled procedures, carrying his phone with its unanswered calls and its growing list of notifications with the practiced composure of someone deferring a reckoning they can't actually defer. At 11:30, the VA Inspector General's office called him again. At noon, his personal attorney, a man named Gilroy, whom he'd retained for a previous unrelated matter and had not spoken to in 2 years, called him, apparently having seen the news coverage and decided that a call was warranted. Hale took the call in his car in the hospital parking garage, engine off, the concrete structure around him muffling the outside world to a low hum. "Marcus," Gilroy said, "talk to me." "I reported a concern," Hale said. "I had reason to believe a staff member was misrepresenting her military service. I raised it with someone at the VA regional office. And it turns out she wasn't misrepresenting it. Apparently her record was classified." "Right." Gilroy was quiet for a moment. "So the question the IG's office is going to ask, and they will ask it, is whether you had any basis beyond personal suspicion for that complaint, whether you attempted any internal verification, whether you used a federal contact in a way that circumvented institutional process." Another pause. "Did you?" The parking garage was very quiet. "I was acting on what I observed," Hale said. "Marcus?" Gilroy's voice had the careful weight of a professional who is about to say something important to a client who may not want to hear it. That's not the same thing as having a factual basis. Hale didn't answer. "I'm going to need you to send me everything," Gilroy said. "Every communication, every text, every email, every call log. Don't delete anything, don't modify anything. I'll be in Creston Falls tomorrow morning." After the call ended, Hale sat in his car for 11 minutes. The concrete around him was damp and smelled of cold and exhaust. Somewhere above him, the hospital continued its ordinary operations, Procedures, rounds, the constant movement of a medical institution running on its own logic. He had been part of that institution for 11 years. He had operated in it as someone whose presence was assumed, whose judgment was deferred to, whose professional authority was a condition of the environment rather than a quality he had to demonstrate. He sat with the specific weight of a man beginning to understand that the ground beneath a certainty he had never questioned was softer than he'd built on. He went back inside. But the security footage review began at 2 p.m. It was conducted by Harlow's internal security director in conjunction with a representative from the JAG office, and it was not primarily focused on Nora. It was focused on the 72 hours preceding her arrest, the period from the nursing station confrontation forward. And it pulled footage from 7 different cameras covering the nursing stations, the physician's lounge, the administrative corridor, and 3 of the common areas where the relevant parties had been documented moving through the building. What the footage showed was unremarkable in most of its hours. People working, walking, talking, the ordinary texture of a hospital day. What it showed in specific segments was less ordinary. At 4:47 p.m. on the day of the confrontation, Marcus Hale was documented in the physician's lounge on his phone. Duration of call, 11 minutes. The call log, obtained through the formal records request, confirmed the recipient. Gerald Stowe, VA Regional Office. At 5:03 p.m. the same day, 16 minutes after that call ended, Devin Marsh, the unit clerk who had posted the original clip, was documented in the same physician's lounge. Devin had no scheduled reason to be in the physician's lounge. He was there for 4 minutes. During those 4 minutes, Hale was also in the room. This was not documented in Devin's account of events. Devin had described, in the statement HR had collected, a spontaneous decision to share the clip with a friend. He had not mentioned being in the physician's lounge that afternoon. He had not mentioned speaking to Hale. The security director flagged the footage at 2:34 p.m. and called Odom. Odom called Park. Park arrived in the security director's office at 3:10 and watched the relevant segments twice without speaking. Then she said to the security director, "I need digital copies of everything from 4 p.m. to 6 p.m. on that day, all cameras." "Already pulling them," he said. "And Devin Marsh? Is he on shift today?" "He called in sick this morning." Park looked at the security director. Something in her expression had become very specific, very focused, the look of a person whose assessment of a situation has just shifted into a more serious register. "Get me his personnel contact information," she said, "and call the JAG office. Tell them we have new material." At 3:45 p.m., Nora was in the break room on the ground floor when Brianna came in and sat down across from her without preamble. They had not had a real conversation since the arrest. There'd been no time, no appropriate moment, the day moving too fast for the kind of conversation that wanted to happen between them. Brianna had been watching Nora from the middle distance all day with the look of someone who had too many things to say and no good ordering for them. She sat down, said nothing for a moment, then, "How are you actually?" "Tired," Nora said. "Hungry. My left shoulder hurts from the way I slept in the car last night." "That's not what I meant." "I know." Brianna looked at her. "I should have fought harder. When Odom called you in, I should have. There was nothing you could have done. I could have been louder." "Brianna," Nora's voice was patient and specific. "Being louder wouldn't have changed the process. It would have just made you feel better temporarily and gotten you in trouble." She paused. "You called Rosario yesterday, during the MCI. That's what you could do, and you did it." Brianna absorbed this. "Rosario called you. You gave her the idea." A silence. The break room was empty at this hour. Mid-afternoon, between the lunch crush and the afternoon push. The coffee machine in the corner was making the sound coffee machines make when they've been running all day and are beginning to resent it. "Devin was in the physician's lounge," Brianna said. "I saw him go in there that afternoon. I thought it was weird. Devin doesn't have any reason to be in there, but I didn't—" She stopped. "I didn't put it together." Nora looked at her. "You know now. Does it matter? I mean, it matters, but for what? What changes?" "A lot is going to change," Nora said. "Some of it is already changing." "Hale is dealing with what he set in motion." Nora's voice held no particular heat. "That's not my job. My job is to be here and to do the work. That's very calm of you. I'm not as calm as I look. Brianna almost smiled. That's somehow very reassuring. Yeah. Devin Marsh called Patricia Odom at 4:22 p.m. He didn't call HR. He didn't call a lawyer. He called Odom directly, which was the decision of someone who was panicking and reverting to the most direct line of authority available to them. He had seen, through the particular network of information that moves through hospital staff, even on sick days, that the security footage was being reviewed. He had understood, in the cold, specific way that people understand things, when a situation they thought was manageable stops being manageable, that the 4 minutes in the physician's lounge were visible, and that visible meant findable, and that findable meant the version of events he had given HR was not going to survive contact with the actual record. Odom took the call in her office with her door closed. Devin talked for 6 minutes. What he said, in its essential shape, was this. Hale had come to him in the physician's lounge the afternoon of the confrontation. Hale had said he was concerned about the nurse with the dog tags, and that he thought the clip Devin had taken. Devin had shown it to a colleague in passing, and Hale had apparently been told about it, might be relevant to a legitimate inquiry. He hadn't told Devin to post it publicly. The word he had used, Devin said, was share. Share it with people who might be concerned. Devin had interpreted this in the way that Devin had interpreted it, and had posted it to the nursing forum, and had genuinely not anticipated the velocity of what followed. He said share, Devin said. He didn't say post it everywhere, but he knew I had it. He knew what he was asking. Odom listened to all of it. Then she said, Devin, I need you to provide this account in writing formally to the JAG office. I need you to do that today. A pause. Am I going to lose my job? Odom was honest, which was the only thing she could be. That depends on the formal process. I can't promise you an outcome. I can tell you that cooperating fully and immediately is the best position you can be in right now. Another pause, longer. Okay, he said. The written statement arrived via email at 5:17 p.m. Park read it at 5:31 and called Briard at 5:33. At 6 p.m., Odom summoned Marcus Hale to her office for the second time in 2 days. This time she had her counsel present, the hospital's risk management director, and a formal record being taken. She placed a printed copy of the security footage log, Devin's written statement, and the call records obtained that morning on the desk between them. Hale looked at them. He said nothing for a long moment. Then, I didn't tell him to post it publicly. You went to him, Odom said. You knew he had the footage. You used the word share. I meant within appropriate channels, within the professional community. I didn't mean Marcus. Her voice had lost the careful neutrality she'd maintained all day. Not anger. Something more serious than anger. The tone of an institution recognizing the shape of something it had been carrying without knowing it. You had a personal conversation with Gerald Stowe at the VA before you came to me, before you went to HR, before you made any internal inquiry at all. You then approached a staff member about footage that you knew was circulating. That footage, in the 24 hours that followed, was used to publicly accuse a colleague of fraud. That colleague is now the subject of a formal JAG investigation, not as the target, but as the wronged party. She let that settle. The question before this institution is not whether you intended harm. The question is what you did and what it produced. Hale sat very still. I believe she was misrepresenting her service, he said. I know you did. I was wrong. Yes. He stopped, started again. I can't undo what I did. No, Odom said. You can't. She picked up the document on top of the pile. Not the statement, not the call records, but a letter, prepared that afternoon, that she had hoped she would not need to present this quickly. Effective tomorrow morning, your operating privileges at Harlow are under formal review. You are not suspended, not yet, not pending the JAG investigation's conclusions and the formal internal review, but you will not be performing procedures until those processes are complete. She set the letter down in front of him. I'm sorry, Marcus, I mean that. He looked at the letter. His jaw was working, and whatever was happening behind his eyes was private and considerable, and he kept it that way, which was Odom thought, perhaps the only quality he displayed in this whole situation that she could genuinely respect. He didn't argue. He didn't produce justifications or deflections, or the particular species of entitled grievance that people in his position sometimes produced when institutional consequence arrived. He picked up the letter, folded it once, put it in his jacket pocket. "All right," he said. He stood, straightened his coat, and he left the office with the particular walk of someone who is maintaining their posture by effort rather than habit, the walk of a person carrying something new and heavy and not yet sure how. The door closed behind him. Odom sat back in her chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment. Risk management murmured something about next steps. Her counsel made a note. She let them talk and looked at the ceiling and thought about the years Hale had been in this building. 11 years, the commendations and the good outcomes and the genuine skill, and thought about how those things and what he had done existed in the same person simultaneously, which was not a comfort but was a fact, and facts had to be worked with regardless of their comfort level. "Draft the formal review notice," she said to no one in particular, "and get me the Veterans Advocacy Liaison. We need to brief them before this goes wider." The story moved faster on the outside than anyone had entirely planned for. At 7:14 p.m., the Creston Falls Courier ran a piece on its website under the headline, "VA Investigation Reveals Wrongful Arrest of Harlow Nurse, Service Record, Confirmed Disciplinary Review Underway." The piece was careful. No names in the disciplinary portion. The details about Nora's specific service history described only in terms of classification levels the Attorney General's office cited for verification. But the shape of what had happened was clear, and the shape moved. By 8 p.m., the piece had been picked up by a regional news aggregator. By 9 p.m., it was being shared across the same platforms that had carried the original clip, appearing in the same comment sections, moving through the same networks, but this time traveling in the opposite direction. The comment sections were not exactly contrition. Internet comment sections are rarely contrition. They were instead the particular noise of a crowd that has been moving in one direction and has now been told the terrain was different than they'd been told, and is reprocessing at speed and with varying degrees of grace. Some people deleted their posts. Some didn't. Several posted apologies that were genuine, and several posted apologies that were primarily concerned with their own discomfort about having been wrong. The veteran advocacy group in Seattle issued a statement expressing support for Nora and acknowledging that their earlier post had been based on incomplete information, which was careful and correct, and would not fully undo the reach of what they'd shared, but was something. Nora did not see most of this in real time. She was in the hospital until 8:30, finishing a shift that had technically started when she'd walked back through the doors that morning, and that nobody had formally assigned her to, but that she'd simply picked up because the department was short and the work was there. She had assessed patients and updated charts and done the ordinary, unglamorous work of emergency nursing for 6 hours, in the same department where she'd been arrested the day before, and had done it without making a production of her presence or her return. At 8:45, she sat in her car in the parking lot, not going home yet, just sitting with the engine off and the windows beginning to fog, and her phone in her hand showing the message from Briard that she'd read 3 times. Odom's formal review is official. IG interview scheduled for Hale on Friday. Footage and Devin's statement are now part of the formal JAG record. This is moving where it needs to move. Get some sleep. She put the phone face down on the passenger seat. Outside the windshield, the hospital was lit against the night. Its windows a grid of light, each one somebody's room, somebody's night, somebody's particular version of the ongoing human work of staying alive or helping others stay alive. She had been in this parking lot hundreds of times. She had driven out of it at the end of hundreds of shifts and not looked back, the way you stop looking at a place you're going to return to. She looked at it now. There was something in the looking that was different from before, harder edged, but also oddly clearer. She had lost something in the past 2 days. The quietness of her life here, the undisturbed anonymity she had built deliberately and maintained carefully. The version of Creston Falls where she was simply a nurse, just a nurse, not a story, not a subject, not a record that people were trying to access or a case that people were investigating. That version was gone. The question was what version replaced it, and she hadn't yet figured out how to hold that question without it feeling heavy. She started the car. She was almost out of the parking lot when her phone rang. She stopped at the exit, looked at the screen. The number was unknown. Not Briard's, not Park's, not anyone in her contacts. She almost didn't answer. She answered. "Ms. Vance." The voice was male, older, with a specific quality of deliberateness that she associated with people who chose their words because they'd learned what happened when you didn't. "My name is Aldous Garrett. I'm an investigative reporter with the Pacific Northwest Tribune. I'd like to speak with you about your experience at Harlow Veterans Medical Center." She held the phone. "I'm not giving interviews," she said. "I understand that. I'm not calling about an interview necessarily. I'm calling because I've been reviewing something that I think you should know about before it becomes public." A pause. "Something that goes beyond what's been reported today." Her hand was steady on the wheel. "What kind of something?" "The complaint filed against you by Dr. Hale," Garrett said. "The one that went to Gerald Stowe at the VA regional office." "I'm aware of the complaint. Are you aware that it wasn't the first time Dr. Hale used that relationship with Stowe for that kind of purpose?" She went still. "There's a previous case," Garrett said carefully. 18 months ago. A different hospital, a different staff member. The situation didn't escalate the way yours did. The staff member resigned before any formal process began. But the structure was the same. Hale, a complaint to Stowe, a rapid federal inquiry, a resignation under pressure. He paused. The staff member's name was James Okafor. He was a veteran. He was also black, which is relevant context for a pattern analysis. The exit of the parking lot, the Creston Falls night beyond it, her hands on the wheel, perfectly still. "Why are you telling me this before you publish it?" she said. "Because you deserve to know," Garrett said, "and because I want to ask you, was there anything in your interactions with Hale that suggested this was personal? A pattern you noticed? Anything you observed before the confrontation at the nursing station?" Nora sat with the question. She had not known about James Okafor. She had not known there was a previous case. She had spent 2 days understanding what had happened to her as a function of this specific moment, this specific situation, Hale's specific conviction, and its specific consequences. She had thought about his genuine service, his genuine belief, the genuinely human mechanism by which conviction tips into action without sufficient evidence. She was now being asked to consider whether conviction was the whole of it. She didn't know. That was the honest answer. She didn't know because she hadn't known about the previous case, and she couldn't reconstruct a pattern she hadn't had all the data points for. And she was tired, and she was alone in a car at the exit of a parking lot at 9 o'clock on a night that had already been too long, and she did not have enough room left in her to be certain about one more thing tonight. "I can't comment on that," she said. "Not tonight." "I understand," Garrett said. "The piece will run day after tomorrow. I wanted you to know." A pause. "For what it's worth, Ms. Vance, what happened to you shouldn't have happened, and what you did in that ED yesterday shouldn't go unrecorded." She said nothing. She drove out of the parking lot and into the street and headed toward her apartment, and the whole of the Creston Falls night spread out around her car, ordinary and dark. And inside her head, the name James Okafor was setting up residence in a space that was going to be uncomfortable to leave vacant. A veteran, a rapid federal inquiry, a resignation under pressure, 18 months ago, before her. She was not, she understood now, the beginning of anything. She was the most recent iteration of something that had been allowed to operate unexamined because the previous person it happened to had walked away quietly, and quiet exits are the best cover a pattern can have. She parked outside her apartment building, sat for a moment. Then she called Briard. He answered in 2 rings. "You should be sleeping. There's a Tribune reporter named Garrett," she said. "He has a previous case, 18 months ago. Hale, Stowe, a veteran named James Okafor, who resigned under pressure. It's the same structure." Silence on the other end that lasted 4 seconds. Not the processing pause, but the different kind, the kind that meant he already knew. "Thomas," she said. "We found it this afternoon," he said. "Park has it. It's being added to the IG file." "You didn't tell me. You'd had enough for 1 day." She looked at the dark street outside her car window. A cat moving along the opposite sidewalk, unhurried. A lit window above a dry cleaner, a shadow passing behind it. "James Okafor," she said. "What happened to him?" Briard took a breath. "He moved to Spokane. He's working in a private clinic. He hasn't spoken publicly. A pause. He knows what's happening here. Park's team made contact this afternoon. Is he going to... That's his decision to make, Breard said. He has to decide what it costs him to tell it. She knew that calculation. She had been living that calculation for 2 days. Get some sleep, Nora, Breard said. Tomorrow Garrett's story starts circulating. Friday the IG has Hale in a room. And by the end of next week... He stopped. What? Odom called me at 7, he said. Off the record, not yet formal. She wants to discuss reinstating you to full clinical duties and moving the credentialing review into a new framework, one that handles classified service records without exposing them to standard verification gaps. A pause. She also wants to know whether you'd be willing to help design it. Nora was quiet. That's... She stopped. She's asking me to help fix the system that was used against me. Yes. That's either very smart or very presumptuous. I'd say it's both, Breard said, which is why I think you might actually say yes. A pause. Sleep first. Everything else is still going to be there in the morning. She got out of the car. The night was cold, and the light above her building's entrance was doing its usual flickering thing that the building manager kept promising to fix. She stood on the sidewalk for a moment looking at it. The intermittent light, on and off, steadying and then stuttering. And then she went inside. At 11:43 that night, Marcus Hale sat in his home office with his laptop open and a document in front of him. Not a legal document, not a formal filing, a draft. Something he had started and deleted twice and started again. The words weren't coming in any order that felt honest, and he couldn't find an honest order because honesty required a full accounting of what he'd done and what he'd assumed, and the gap between the two was larger than it had looked from the inside. He closed the laptop. His phone showed 6 missed calls. Gilroy. Stowe twice. And those 2 calls from Stowe told him something about the state of Gerald Stowe's afternoon that he didn't entirely want to think about. The IG office once more. And one from a number he'd looked up and confirmed as belonging to Aldous Garrett of the Pacific Northwest Tribune. He hadn't returned that last call. He wasn't going to return it tonight. He sat in the quiet of his home office at 11:43 and thought about a man named James Okafor, whom he had not thought about in over a year, not because he'd forgotten, but because Okafor had resigned and the situation had resolved in the quiet way situations sometimes resolve, and Hale had accepted that resolution without examining it. He was examining it now. The thing he had not known about himself. The thing that was becoming visible to him in the uncomfortable way that things become visible when the outside world starts mapping your actions in a different coordinate system than the one you've been using, was not that he was a dishonest man. He wasn't. He believed genuinely in the principles he cited. He believed in the integrity of military service and the wrongness of false claims and the obligation of people in positions of authority to act on what they saw. What he had not examined, and what was now being examined for him whether he wanted it or not, was the question of who he decided to see and who he decided to look at closely, and why. That question did not have a comfortable answer. Outside his window, the Creston Falls night was the same as any other night, and in a federal office in Portland, the IG investigator assigned to this case was adding 2 new items to her file: Devin Marsh's statement and the preliminary documentation from Park's team regarding James Okafor. The picture the file was assembling looked considerably different than the picture that had existed 48 hours ago. And in the morning, Aldous Garrett would sit down at his desk and open his notes, and begin writing the piece that would, by evening, make that picture visible to everyone in Creston Falls who had shared the original clip and thought they had understood what they were looking at. They were about to understand something else entirely. Aldous Garrett's piece ran at 6:47 a.m. on Thursday, earlier than his editor had originally planned, because by Wednesday evening 2 other outlets had begun making calls that suggested the story was leaking at its edges and the Tribune's advantage was narrowing by the hour. The piece was 4,000 words, carefully sourced, and it did what good investigative journalism does at its best. It didn't tell people what to feel. It assembled what had happened in chronological order with enough documented detail that the feeling arrived on its own, unavoidably, by the end of the 3rd section. The headline was simple: a pattern of pressure. How one surgeon's complaints ended 2 veterans' careers. and what happened when the third refused to go quietly. The piece opened not with Nora, but with James Okafor. Garrett had spent Tuesday evening on the phone with him. A careful conversation, Garrett would say later, the kind you have with someone who has been waiting to see whether the world was going to require anything of them before deciding whether to re-enter a fight they'd already lost once. James Okafor was 41, a former Army medic who had served 2 tours and then gone into nursing after discharge. He had worked at a hospital in Tacoma 18 months ago. He had been confronted by Hale, who had been at that hospital for a visiting surgical consult, about the Bronze Star citation on his employee profile. He had provided documentation. The documentation had been deemed insufficient through a process he didn't fully understand at the time. He had been placed under investigation through the same Stowe VA pipeline that had reached Nora. He had resigned before the formal process completed because the public attention had made continuing untenable, and because nobody at the institution had stood beside him, and because, at 39 years old, with a daughter in middle school and a mortgage and a life to protect, the cost of fighting had simply outweighed what he had left to fight with. "I know what I did," Okafor told Garrett in the piece. "I know what I gave. I don't need anyone to validate that." But when you're standing in a hospital corridor and a senior physician is questioning your service with that particular kind of certainty, the kind that assumes it already knows the answer, and nobody around you says anything, you start to understand that you're going to have to spend everything you have just to stay in a place that's already decided you don't belong there. A pause in the transcript. "I didn't have everything left, so I left." The piece ran that alongside the documentation from the JAG office's formal review. It ran Hale's call records, the security footage timeline, Devon's written account of the physician's lounge conversation. It ran a statement from Gerald Stowe, who had, by Wednesday afternoon, retained his own attorney and was cooperating fully with the IG investigation in the specific way that people cooperate fully when they understand that cooperation is now their best remaining option. Acknowledging that he had expedited both inquiries based on Hale's representations, and that in retrospect the speed of both processes had not allowed adequate independent verification. The piece was factually airtight. It named no conclusions it hadn't documented, and it ended, in Garrett's measured prose, with Daniel Rourke's mother Corinne confirming that the person who had saved her son's life during the mass casualty event was the same woman who had been transported to Harlow under federal custody, and that she had not known that at the time, and that she was telling it now because she thought people deserved to know what kind of person they had spent 2 days calling a fraud. By 8 a.m., the piece had 60,000 readers. By 10 a.m., it had been picked up nationally. Also, Nora read it at her kitchen table over coffee she'd made too strong, in the particular way she always made coffee when she'd slept badly, which was a thing she'd never told anyone and which nobody knew about her, one of the dozens of small private textures that make up a life. She read it once straight through, then put her phone face down on the table and sat with the specific discomfort of seeing your own story assembled by someone else, accurate and fair, and still somehow strange, the way mirrors are strange, the way you never quite recognize the version of yourself that other people see. She had not spoken to Okafor directly. That was something she had thought about Tuesday night, and again Wednesday morning. The right words, the right form of contact, and had ultimately decided to defer until the formal process was further along, because reaching out prematurely felt like it would make his story about her. And his story was not about her. His story was his. She would find the right moment. She finished her coffee, got dressed, drove to Harlow. The hospital felt different that morning. Not calmer, not louder. Different in the specific way of an institution that has been publicly documented doing something wrong and is now in the process of absorbing that documentation into its self-understanding. People moved with the slightly altered quality of people who are aware they are being watched, not externally, but by themselves, which is a more uncomfortable kind of watching. Staff who had shared the original clip and had spent Wednesday deleting posts now navigated the corridors with the particular self-consciousness of people managing a private accounting. Nobody said anything directly to Nora about the piece. They didn't need to. The air said it. Brianna met her at the nursing station with coffee in a mug that said Creston Falls Half Marathon 2021, battered, handles slightly chipped, the kind of mug that had survived long enough to mean something. She held it out without ceremony. Nora took it. "Okafor," Brianna said. Quietly, not a question. "I know." Did you know before Garrett called you? No. Brianna was quiet for a moment. There could be others. There could be, Nora agreed. The IG investigation will find them if they exist. That's what the process is for. She said it the way she said most things, level, without performance, but Brianna heard something underneath it that was not quite level, the small pressure of someone who had spent the night lying in the dark, thinking about a man she'd never met who had left a fight because he had run out of what it took to stay in it, and wondering what it meant that she had not run out, and whether the difference was circumstance or character or luck, or something too complicated to name. You okay? Brianna said. Ask me that again in a few weeks, Nora said. Right now, I need to know where we are with the overnight patients. Brianna gave her the update. They went to work. What? The IG interview with Marcus Hale took place on Friday morning in a federal office building 12 minutes from Harlow, in a room with a recording device on the table, and two investigators who had been doing this long enough to have no patience for answers that weren't answers. Gilroy sat beside Hale throughout. He had prepared his client extensively. 2 days of preparation, detailed and thorough, covering every angle of every question Gilroy had anticipated. He was a good attorney. The preparation showed. What preparation couldn't cover was the James Okafor question, because the Okafor documentation was new enough that Gilroy had only received it Wednesday night, which gave him 1 day instead of 2, and 1 day was not enough to find a framing for this happened before, with the same structure and the same federal contact that didn't make it look like what it looked like. The lead investigator's name was Dana Frost. She was 53, had spent 11 years in the IG office, and had a reputation for a specific interviewing quality. She was not aggressive. She was patient. She asked the same question in slightly different forms until the answer that came out matched the one the documentation supported. And she had all the time in the world because the recording device didn't get tired. Dr. Hale, she said in the second hour of the interview, walk me through your decision-making when you approached the unit clerk, Devin Marsh, in the physician's lounge. Hale gave the answer he had prepared. He had believed the footage might be relevant to a legitimate inquiry. He had suggested it be shared through appropriate channels. He had not directed Devin to post it publicly. Appropriate channels, Frost said. When you say that, what channels specifically were you referring to? A pause. The professional community. Other medical staff who might have information. Not HR? A beat. I didn't use that word specifically. Did you use the word private? Did you indicate to Mr. Marsh that this was something that should remain within the institution rather than go to the public? The room was very quiet. I don't recall using those specific words, Hale said. Frost looked at him for a moment. Then she opened a folder and set a printed page on the table between them. Devin's written statement, the specific passage highlighted in yellow. She didn't say anything about it. She just placed it there and moved to the next question. That was the technique. Not accusation. Documentation. Placed quietly, allowed to mean what it meant. By the end of the third hour, the shape of what the investigation had assembled was clear enough that Gilroy called a 15-minute recess and spent it in a corridor conversation with Hale that Hale did not enjoy, and that left him returning to the interview room with the particular compressed stillness of someone who has just been told, by someone whose job is to protect them, that the most defensible position available is also the most costly one. He cooperated fully with the remaining questions. He did not, that day or any day after it, claim he had acted in bad faith. He had believed what he believed. That remained true. But belief, the investigation's final report would note, is not a substitute for process, and the absence of process, the consistent documented pattern of bypassing institutional verification in favor of a direct federal contact, had produced outcomes that damaged real people, and the pattern was not coincidence. The report cited 2 cases. It did not rule out others. 3 weeks after the arrest, Patricia Odom called a mandatory all-staff meeting in Harlow's largest conference facility, the one used for continuing education seminars with a projector screen and 240 chairs. Attendance was required for all department heads, all attending physicians, and all senior nursing staff. It was not optional, which was a word Odom used specifically in the meeting notice and which sent a clear signal about the register of what was coming. She stood at the front of the room without slides, without notes, without the particular administrative armor of a podium. She had given enough crisis communications in her career to know that the version of a statement that actually reaches people is the one that looks like a person talking, rather than an institution performing accountability. 3 weeks ago, she said, a member of our staff was publicly accused of fraud, placed under administrative leave without completed verification, arrested on federal charges that were subsequently determined to be based on a gap in our verification systems rather than any action on her part, and detained while simultaneously providing emergency care during a mass casualty event that tested this department's limits. She paused. That sequence of events represents multiple failures, institutional, procedural, and human, that I intend to address systematically and without softening. The room was the particular kind of quiet that comes when 200 people are collectively not moving. Nora Vance's military service is genuine, decorated, and has now been formally verified at the appropriate federal level. She is fully reinstated with complete back pay and without condition. The administrative leave has been expunged from her personnel file. Odom looked across the room, not at anyone specific, at the whole of it. The investigation into the circumstances that led to her arrest has identified failures at multiple levels, including the conduct of a physician whose complaint initiated the federal inquiry, the verification procedures that failed to catch a classification gap, and this institution's responsiveness to public pressure over institutional process. All three of those are being addressed through formal channels. She didn't name Hale. She didn't need to. 200 people knew who she meant, and naming him would have made the meeting about him specifically rather than about the larger shape of what had gone wrong, which was what Odom actually needed to address. We are implementing 3 changes, effective immediately, she said. First, a revised credentialing protocol for staff with classified military service records, developed in partnership with the JAG office and, with her agreement, with Nora Vance, who has the most direct experience of where our existing process breaks down. Second, a mandatory escalation procedure requiring that any concern about staff credentials go through HR credentialing and department heads before any external inquiry is initiated. Third, a formal veteran support liaison role within HR, dedicated to ensuring that staff with military backgrounds have access to appropriate channels for record verification without the gaps that produce this situation. She stopped. I want to say one more thing, she said, and her voice shifted slightly. Not louder, but more direct. What happened to Nora Vance was accelerated by public attention. We, as a staff, as a community inside this institution, allowed the velocity of social media to substitute for process. Some of you shared those posts. Some of you formed opinions before any facts were verified. I understand why. The speed of that environment makes it feel like engagement is the responsible choice. But speed and responsibility are not the same thing, and what Nora Vance experienced in the 48 hours after that clip was posted, the public verdict, the professional consequence, the institutional failure to pause, is what happens when we treat velocity as judgment. She looked at the room. I hope we don't need to learn that lesson again. She walked off the stage without additional ceremony. In the 4th row, Brianna Solis let out a slow breath that she'd been holding approximately since the meeting started. Beside her, Rosario had her arms crossed and her chin up, and the particular expression of someone who is satisfied in a way that doesn't require external expression. Darnell, 2 seats down, was looking at his hands with the complicated expression of someone working through where he fit in the accounting. Nora was in the back row. She had almost not come. Odom had told her the meeting was happening and that it was not required for her specifically, that Nora could receive the summary afterward, could skip the experience of sitting in a room while her own situation was described to 200 colleagues. Odom had offered this with genuine consideration, and Nora had, for one moment, genuinely considered it. Then she had decided that absence was its own statement and presence was hers to make or not make, and she would make it. So she sat in the back row in her scrubs. She had a shift after this, her second full shift of the week. And she listened to Patricia Odom describe what had happened, and she felt what she felt about it with the same private discipline she'd brought to all the other things she'd felt over the past 3 weeks, which was feel it, register it, don't let it run away with you, then put it somewhere manageable and get back to work. What she felt sitting there was not triumph. It was something more complicated and less satisfying than triumph. The specific texture of an outcome that was just but also late, that was correct but only after being wrong, that restored something without being able to pretend the damage of its absence hadn't happened. You could not give back the 2 days. You could not give back Devon's post and its 100,000 shares and the comment sections full of certainties. You could not give James Okafor his job in Tacoma or the year and a half he'd spent in Spokane rebuilding something smaller than what he'd had. Justice, when it arrives into the reality of what already happened, and that reality doesn't reorganize itself to fit the better ending. She knew that. She had always known that. It was one of the things 9 years of operating in environments where the outcomes were frequently unjust had installed in her at a level below conscious thought. The understanding that the best outcomes and the just outcomes were not always the same thing, and that you did the work anyway, because the alternative was doing nothing, and doing nothing was its own damage. After the meeting ended, people moved toward the exits in the usual way, some quickly, some stopping to talk, the particular mill of a large group breaking into smaller ones. Several people approached Nora. Some said things that were genuine, and some said things that were appropriate, and she accepted all of them with equal brevity, because this was not a moment she was interested in extending. One person came to her who was not one of the colleagues she'd expected. Dr. Elliot Marsh, chief of emergency medicine, navigated the crowd with the unhurried competence of a man who was used to moving through complicated spaces. He stopped in front of her and looked at her with the direct, ungarnished attention of someone who had already formed his assessment and was not performing the formation of it. "I want you to know," he said, "that the incident report I filed was not a favor." "I know," she said. "It was an accurate documentation of what I observed clinically. What happened in Bay 8 was significant and needed to be on the record for reasons that had nothing to do with anything that was happening to you legally." He paused. "That said, I'm glad it was useful in the other context." "So am I." He looked at her for a moment longer. "Odom mentioned you're working on the credentialing protocol redesign." "Yes. I'd like to be part of that conversation, from a clinical practice standpoint." He said it without embellishment. "Some of what you did during the MCY, the organizational management, the triage decision-making, there are things I'd want to incorporate into how we train residents. With your involvement, if you're willing." Nora looked at him. "Send me your calendar," she said. He nodded. Moved on. She was back on the floor by noon. Bay 4 had a 67-year-old veteran with an infected wound site who had waited 3 days before coming in because, as he told Nora with the specific embarrassed candor of a man who knew he'd been stubborn, "I thought it would get better on its own." It hadn't. She cleaned the wound and updated the treatment protocol and talked to him for approximately 12 minutes about the difference between toughness and avoidance, which he received with the expression of a man who had heard this before but needed to hear it again from someone whose body language made clear she wasn't judging him, just stating a fact. Bay 7 had a 22-year-old with a panic attack presenting as cardiac symptoms who was terrified and needed, more than anything, someone to sit beside her for 4 minutes and make the room smaller and less terrifying, which was not a clinical intervention that appeared in any protocol, but which Nora had learned over 9 years and 14 months, and the accumulated weight of being present in people's worst moments, was frequently the most effective thing available. Bay 11 had paperwork that needed doing that nobody had done, and she did it. The afternoon moved in the way afternoon moves in an emergency department. Not evenly, not dramatically, just the ongoing press of people who needed things and the ongoing work of providing them. It was not the work she had been trained for originally. It was not the work that had occupied the 9 years she couldn't fully talk about. But it was the work she had chosen when she came out the other side of those 9 years, and the choosing mattered. She had not ended up here by accident or default. She had decided that the particular kind of help available in an emergency department, the immediate, physical, unglamorous, occasionally life-altering help, was the kind she wanted to provide. And she had come to Creston Falls and built a life around providing it. That life had been interrupted. It had been attacked in public, and it had been put in handcuffs, and it had been tested in ways she hadn't anticipated when she'd built it. But it was intact, dented and publicly documented, and somewhat irreversibly changed in its relationship to privacy, but intact. At 3:30 p.m., her phone buzzed with a message from a number she had added to her contacts 2 days ago. James Okafor. "I read the Garrett piece," he wrote. I read about the MCI. I heard you were reinstated. Glad it went differently for you." She stood in the corridor between Bay 6 and Bay 7 and thought about what to write back and found, for the first time in recent memory, that she was uncertain about the right words in a way that was not comfortable. She was accustomed to uncertainty in clinical situations. Uncertainty was information, something to assess and respond to. This was different. This was the uncertainty of a person trying to reach across a gap she hadn't made and couldn't close but also couldn't ignore. She wrote, "It went differently because of what you did. You created a record, even when you left. The pattern existed because you were first. The investigation found it because there was something to find. That matters." She waited. 3 minutes passed. Then, "I didn't think of it that way." "I know," she wrote, "but it's true." Another pause. Then, "There's a private clinic opening in Creston Falls next spring. A colleague told me about it. I've been thinking about applying." She read that twice. "You should," she wrote. "This city could use more people like you." She put her phone in her pocket and went back to work. The formal outcomes arrived over the following weeks in the specific staggered way of institutional and federal processes, which do not coordinate their timing for dramatic effect, but produce their conclusions on the schedules of their own bureaucratic rhythms. The VA Inspector General's report was released 5 weeks after the arrest. It cited Gerald Stowe for a pattern of accepting complaints from a repeat source without conducting independent verification, and recommended a formal review of his office's procedures. It did not fire him. The IG's office rarely fires. But it documented his conduct in terms that would follow his file in ways he would spend years managing. He resigned 8 weeks later, citing a desire to pursue other opportunities, which was the language people use when they have concluded the opportunity to leave is better than the prospect of staying. The State Medical Board, separately, opened a review of Marcus Hale's conduct. This was not the hospital's doing and not the JAG office's doing. It was initiated by a formal complaint filed by the Okafor family's attorney, who had retained counsel the week after Garrett's piece ran, and who had decided, with Okafor's agreement, that the pattern documented in the piece met the threshold for a professional conduct complaint. The board review was slow, as board reviews are, and its outcome would not be clear for months. But it existed, and its existence was a matter of public record. And public record in a medical community is a particular kind of consequence that operates on its own timeline. At Harlow, Hale's operating privileges were restored 4 weeks after their suspension, pending the board review's conclusion. Odom had made the decision after consultation with legal counsel and the risk management team. The hospital could not indefinitely suspend a physician against whom no internal finding of clinical misconduct had been made, and Hale had done nothing clinically wrong. His technical skills remained what they had always been. He returned to the OR. He was quieter in the corridors than he had been before, and the specific quality of authority he had once carried through the building had changed its texture, still present but differently weighted, carrying something it hadn't carried before, which was the visible knowledge that the people around him had read about him in a newspaper and had formed their own assessments. He did not go to Nora. She had not expected him to. She had wondered about it abstractly in the quiet late shift hours when there was time to wonder about things. But she had concluded that whatever accounting he was doing with himself was his to do, and that what she needed from him was not an apology, but an absence of further harm, and that an absence of further harm was, from where she stood, sufficient. She was not a person who needed the villain to kneel. She was a person who needed the damage to stop. Devin Marsh was terminated from his position at Harlow 6 weeks after the arrest, following the completion of the internal HR investigation. The finding was that he had shared patient-adjacent workplace footage in a way that violated multiple institutional policies, and had done so in a context where a senior physician's involvement made his claim of spontaneous independent action not fully credible. He hired an employment attorney and filed a wrongful termination claim that settled out of court for an amount that was not disclosed, which was how those things went. Brianna heard about the settlement and told Nora in the break room on a Thursday afternoon, expecting a reaction. Nora said, "Okay," and asked whether anyone had updated the whiteboard for the incoming shift, which was not the reaction Brianna had expected, but was, she was coming to understand, very much the reaction of the person Nora actually was. 6 weeks after the arrest, Major General Warren Aldis came back to Creston Falls. He came back because he had made a commitment, and he was the kind of man who kept commitments with the same discipline he brought to everything else. Not because keeping them was easy, but because the alternative to keeping them was being the kind of person who didn't, and he had no interest in being that person at this stage of his life or any other. The commitment was a formal one. He had made it in Odom's office on the morning he'd arrived, in the meeting that Nora had attended. A commitment that a commendation long held in classified status would be formally presented to Nora Vance in a setting that reflected the actual weight of what she had done and what she had endured. The presentation happened in Harlow's main conference room on a Thursday afternoon, with the room arranged not for a seminar but for something closer to a ceremony. Chairs facing forward, the hospital's veteran outreach director managing the logistics, General Breard and Colonel Park seated to one side, Odom and Marsh and a representative from the state VA office in the front row. Nora had been asked what she wanted from the event, and had said, "Keep it short." She had not said that dismissively. She'd said it the way she said most things, directly and without apology, and Aldis had responded, agreed, and kept his word. The room held about 60 people, nursing staff, attending physicians, a few residents, the veteran patients advocate from the VA Partnership Program, Corinne Rourke, who had driven 3 hours and had sat down in the third row, and when Nora saw her had looked away quickly, because there are some things you can't receive without losing some of the composure you've been maintaining, and Corinne Rourke represented one of them. Brianna was in the second row, having claimed her seat aggressively 40 minutes before anyone else arrived. James Okafor was not in the room. He had sent a message declining, which Nora respected completely, because his presence would have made the event about him in a way he hadn't consented to. And he was a man in the process of rebuilding something private, and the rebuilding was not a performance. Aldis spoke for 11 minutes. He did not read from prepared remarks. He said what he had observed in his career about the specific quality of people who do exceptional work in exceptional circumstances without requiring acknowledgement. The people who do it because it needs doing, not because someone is watching. He said that in 31 years of military service, he had met a small number of those people, and that Nora Vance was among them, and that the commendation he was about to present had been classified not because she had done anything wrong, but because the world wasn't ready to know about it yet, and that the world's readiness or unreadiness was not a measure of the work's value. He presented the commendation, a formal citation on heavy paper with the relevant signatures, and alongside it a second document, which was the DoD's formal public acknowledgement of her service, released from classification for the specific purpose of this moment. Nora accepted both with both hands. She looked at them. She did not cry, which was not because she wasn't feeling anything, but because she was feeling something very specific that was not sadness and was not triumph and was not even quite relief. It was something more fundamental than any of those, something that lived at the level of having spent years carrying a weight that nobody else could see and having it suddenly, visibly acknowledged as real. The weight didn't go away. You couldn't put down something that had become structural to how you moved through the world, but it was seen now. That mattered. It mattered in a way she hadn't let herself admit it mattered until this moment, which was probably the most honest thing she'd felt in several years. She looked up. The room was quiet in the way rooms get quiet when they're waiting for someone to speak. She hadn't prepared anything. She had been asked if she wanted to say something and had said she'd decide in the moment, which was the kind of thing that sounds cavalier and is actually the only way she knew how to do it. You couldn't plan sincerity. You could only arrive at the moment and see what was actually there. What was there? When she looked at the room, at Brianna, who had been the first person to try to help her, and who was making no attempt to hide how she was feeling, at Corinne Rourke, who had driven 3 hours to be in a room with the person who had saved her son, at Elliot Marsh, who had filed an honest report when he could have filed a cautious one, at Rosario, who had made a phone call that wasn't in any protocol because it was the right thing to do, at the residents and the nurses and the patient's advocate, and the 60 people who had found their way into this room for a ceremony that was short and not particularly ceremonial. What was, there was something specific and hard-edged and real. "I didn't come to Creston Falls to be a story," she said. Her voice was even, the way it was always even. But this evenness was different from the evenness of professional composure. This was the evenness of someone saying something true. "I came here to work, to be useful. That's what I had done before, in a different context, and it was what I wanted to keep doing. She paused. What happened 3 weeks ago? The arrest, the posts, the 2 days of other people deciding out loud what kind of person I was. I'm not going to tell you it didn't cost me something. It did. Anyone who tells you that kind of public verdict rolls off them isn't being honest about how it actually lands. The room was very still. But I want to say something about what I learned. Not about the system, not about process. The process is being fixed, and that's Odom's work and the JAG's work, and it'll be better than it was. I mean, something about the people in this room. She looked at them. Rosario called me. During the MCI. She didn't have institutional cover for that call. She made it because she knew what the situation needed. Elliot Marsh filed an honest report when he could have filed a cautious one. Brianna, her voice shifted fractionally. Brianna told me about the posts when she could have said nothing. James Okafor told his story to a reporter when he had already paid the price of telling it once and gotten nothing back. She stopped for a moment. None of those were easy calls. None of them came with guaranteed outcomes. They were just people deciding, in specific moments, whether the thing that was true mattered more than the thing that was convenient. She looked down at the commendation in her hands, then back up. That's the work, not the ceremonial part. Not this, the part where you have to decide in an ordinary moment on an ordinary day whether you're going to say the true thing or the safe thing. Those are the decisions that actually determine what kind of place this is. She thanked Aldous. She thanked Briard. She said she was going back to work. She meant it literally. She had a shift starting in 40 minutes. And the directness of it, the complete absence of drama and the transition from this moment to the next, produced something in the room that was not quite laughter and not quite tears, and was perhaps the truest version of both. She shook Aldis's hand. She stopped in front of Corinne Rourke's chair, and Corinne stood up, and they looked at each other for a moment. Two women in a conference room in Creston Falls, Washington, connected by a 16-year-old named Daniel, who had gone to a music festival and would be going home in 2 days with a scar on his chest that he'd probably show his friends, and a story he'd tell for the rest of his life about the woman in the ED who had known exactly what to do. "Thank you," Corinne said. Simple and direct. "He did the hard part," Nora said. "He stayed." She walked to the door. Brianna caught up to her in the corridor, slightly out of breath from moving fast in the crowd. "You're actually leaving." "I have a shift." "You just got a commendation from a 2-star general." "I know. I also have a patient in Bay 4 who came back this morning with the same wound, and I want to know why the antibiotics aren't working." She pushed through the stairwell door. "You coming, or are you staying for the reception?" Brianna stared at her for a half second. Then, "There's a reception?" "Odom ordered food, I think. Someone mentioned sandwiches." "I could get a sandwich and then come." "Brianna." "Coming," Brianna said, and went through the door. Balkan. The thing about being the kind of person who does the work without needing anyone to watch is that you don't stop being that person when people start watching. Nora knew this about herself the way she knew most things about herself. Not because she'd sat with it and examined it, but because she'd been in enough situations where the quality either held or it didn't, and she knew which way hers had consistently gone. It wasn't heroism. It was closer to habit. She had been trained, and then she had practiced, and then she had done it enough times under enough different conditions that it had become the default. And the default didn't require an audience. The thing she had learned in the 3 weeks since the arrest was something she hadn't anticipated learning. She had expected the ordeal to cost her something: the privacy, the quiet anonymity, the undisturbed professional life she'd built. She'd known it would cost her those things, and had been correct. What she hadn't expected was what the ordeal had also given her, which was visibility she hadn't sought and connection she hadn't asked for, and a set of relationships. Rosario, Marsh, Corinne Rourke, an intake MP who had said good work in there and meant it, a reporter named Garrett who had assembled the shape of what happened with genuine care, that had arrived at a cost she wouldn't have chosen, but that were, undeniably, real. She had not come to Creston Falls looking for community. She had come looking for work and quiet and a normal life. And she had found those things. And then she had been stripped of them publicly, And then she had found, on the other side of that stripping, that the community had been there all along, waiting for the circumstance that would make it visible. That was the thing she hadn't expected. That was the thing she would carry. In Bay 4, the 67-year-old veteran with the returning wound infection was waiting with the guilty expression of a man who knows he hasn't followed instructions and is going to have to admit it. His name was Frank Derringer, retired Army, 2 daughters, a wife who had told him to come back 2 days ago and whom he had not listened to. Nora pulled up his chart. "Frank." "I know," he said. "You stopped the antibiotics early. They were making me feel bad. They were working." She set the chart down and looked at him. "What part of finish the course was ambiguous?" You thought you knew better than the protocol." He had the decency to look sheepish. "When you put it like that." "I'm putting it like that because that's what happened." She pulled on a glove. "Here's what we're going to do. We're going to clean this again. We're going to culture it because you've given the bacteria a head start, and then you're going to take the full new course even when you feel better. All the way to the end, you understand?" "Yes." "And your wife was right. She usually is," Frank said, with the resigned affection of a man who has accepted this as fact. "You don't have to tell her that." "I'm going to tell her exactly that," Nora said, "when she picks you up." Frank laughed, which made him wince because laughing pulled at the wound, which was what happened when you got a wound infection in your 60s and waited too long to come in. Nora cleaned and dressed it with the same economical precision she brought to everything, and Frank watched her hands work and said, because he was the kind of man who said things when he felt them, "I heard what happened to you a few weeks ago, with the arrest and all of it." She didn't look up from the wound. "Word travels." "In a VA hospital, it travels fast." He paused. "That was a bad business." "It's resolved." "I know. I read the article." He watched her hands. "Just wanted to say, I know it doesn't fix it, but from where I'm sitting, someone who actually served, who actually knows. Those tags are real. Anyone who looks at you for 5 minutes knows those tags are real." Nora stopped for a fraction of a second. Then she finished the dressing, smoothed the tape down with 2 fingers, pulled off her glove. She looked at Frank Derringer, 67, stubborn, wound-infected, watched by a wife who was usually right, sitting in Bay 4 at Harlow Veterans Medical Center in Creston Falls, Washington, on an ordinary Thursday afternoon, and felt something settle in her chest that had been unsettled for 3 weeks and maybe longer. The specific sensation of being seen not by a ceremony or a commendation or a formal vindication, but by a person, in passing, because the truth of you was visible to someone who knew what they were looking at. "Thank you, Frank," she said. "Don't thank me. Finish what you start." He looked at the dressing on his arm, like some people are going to do with their antibiotics this time. "All the way to the end," she agreed. She stepped out of Bay 4 and into the corridor of the ED. The noise and the motion and the ongoing, undecorated work of the place. And she picked up the next chart and kept going. The truth doesn't need to announce itself. It doesn't need an audience or a moment or the right circumstances. It exists at the level of what you actually did, in the places where you actually did it, in the people who were there and who know. Everything else is just the world catching up.